I heard the man about to marry my daughter laugh in the shadows of a country club hallway. He told his best friend he would rather chew glass than touch that desperate cow. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just a naive old man with an endless checkbook. He was entirely wrong. I did not scream. I did not throw a single punch. I smiled, walked away, and meticulously dismantled his entire existence. My name is Derek. I am 69 years old, and I have spent my entire life protecting my family. Before I tell you exactly how I ruined a man who thought he could use my daughter, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe true family loyalty means ruthlessly cutting out the poison. The crystal chandeliers of the downtown country club cast a warm golden glow over the lavish engagement party. I paid for every prime rib, every imported orchid, and every drop of champagne flowing into the glasses of our 80 guests. My daughter Naomi stood at the center of the room. She is 32 years old, a brilliant architect, but she has always carried deep, painful insecurities about her appearance. Tonight she wore a stunning emerald dress radiating a rare happiness I had not seen in years. Beside her stood Brent. He was 34, a white finance executive with a polished smile and a firm, practiced handshake. He played the perfect gentleman, charming my African-American relatives with rehearsed compliments and loud declarations of his love for Naomi. My cousins nodded in approval, impressed by his smooth talk and his supposedly impressive corporate job title. I watched him closely from the edge of the room. A father sees things that others miss entirely. I noticed the fraying stitching near the cuff of his suit jacket and the cheap synthetic fabric attempting to mimic fine Italian wool. I know a cheap suit when I see one. In the 1980s, I started a logistics company with a single rusty truck and a pocket full of unpaid bills. Over 4 grueling decades, I built that single truck into a massive regional shipping empire before selling it and retiring quietly. I learned early on how to spot a man pretending to be something he is not. Brent had the vocabulary of wealth, but the desperate, lingering aura of a man faking his success. Naomi leaned her head on his shoulder, completely blind to the slight stiffening of his jaw when she touched him. He weaponized her insecurities, playing the role of her handsome savior while looking down on the very people funding his drinks. The noise of the live jazz band and the constant clinking of glasses grew too loud for me. I stepped away from the main ballroom and walked down a dimly lit service hallway to take a call from my former property manager. Halfway down the narrow corridor, the heavy, pungent scent of expensive cigar smoke caught my attention. I stopped in my tracks. 2 figures leaned against the concrete wall near the loading dock exit. It was Brent and his best man, Gavin. They were speaking in hushed, incredibly arrogant tones. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, entirely hidden behind a stack of unused banquet chairs. Gavin took a long drag from his cigar and chuckled darkly. He asked Brent how he was managing to keep up the loving fiancé act all night without breaking character. Brent let out a cold, cynical laugh that made the hair on my arms stand up. I would rather chew glass than touch that desperate cow, Brent sneered. He flicked his ash carelessly onto the clean floor. But I do not have a choice in the matter. She is a naive ATM, and her old man is completely clueless about how finance works. I absolutely need this wedding to happen right away. That hedge fund margin call is going to bury me alive if I do not get my hands on her accounts by next month. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. A sudden violent rage surged through my chest, burning hot and fast. My hands clenched into tight fists until my fingernails dug deep into my palms, drawing actual blood. The urge to step out of the shadows, grab him by his cheap lapels, and throw him through the glass exit door was almost overwhelming. But a lifetime of brutal business negotiations had taught me that emotion is the ultimate enemy of strategy. If I confronted him right now, he would completely deny it. He would spin a flawless lie about a misunderstood joke. Naomi, blinded by her desperate need for validation and love, would defend him fiercely. She would view me as a controlling, bitter father trying to ruin her happiness. I could not just break his nose. I needed to break his entire reality. I needed undeniable concrete proof of his massive financial desperation and his utter lack of human morality. I slowly uncreased my fists, took a long, silent breath, and turned around. I walked quietly back down the hallway, leaving the 2 men to their vile amusement. My mind was already racing, calculating every possible angle, mapping out a trap so perfect he would never see the walls closing in until it was far too late to escape. I stepped back into the glowing warmth of the main ballroom. The music played on, completely ignorant of the war that had just been declared in the dark corridor. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and smoothed the front of my tailored jacket. I walked toward the main bar just as Brent and Gavin returned from their smoke break. Brent had a wide, incredibly fake smile plastered across his face once again. He loudly signaled the bartender, calling over a waiter to bring a specific vintage bottle of wine he had ordered earlier to impress his finance friends. The waiter approached, carrying the expensive bottle and a black leather checkbook. Brent casually pulled a heavy metallic credit card from his wallet and dropped it onto the tray with an air of absolute superiority. He did not even bother to look at the bill. A minute later, the waiter returned. He leaned in very close to Brent, his voice discreet but perfectly audible to me standing just a few feet away. "I am sorry, sir," the waiter murmured politely. The card was declined. Brent's arrogant smile vanished instantly. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He patted his pockets frantically, his breathing quickening as his friends watched in sudden, uncomfortable silence. He stammered a pathetic excuse about a bank security freeze due to unusual international travel expenses. I stepped forward smoothly, pulling a crisp stack of $100 bills from my silver money clip. I placed the cash directly onto the waiter's tray. I told Brent not to worry about it, adding casually that banking systems can be terribly unreliable these days. I patted his shoulder firmly, letting my hand linger just a second too long, squeezing his collarbone. Brent looked at me, a flash of genuine panic visible in his eyes. He nodded stiffly and thanked me, completely unaware that I was not doing him a favor at all. I was simply buying my front row ticket to his complete destruction. The silent war had begun, and he had already lost the very first battle without even realizing he was under attack. The morning sun cut through the heavy mahogany blinds of my home office. I sat at my desk and pulled a specific manila folder from the bottom drawer. Inside was a standard employment background check form. I had made Brent fill it out 6 months ago under the guise of setting him up with a lucrative consulting gig through one of my old corporate contacts. He was too eager to impress me to read the privacy waiver. I dialed the direct line for Hayes. Hayes was my former corporate attorney, a man who navigated the legal system with the cold precision of a striking viper. He handled the acquisition of my logistics company a decade ago and knew exactly how to dismantle a target. I read Brent's social security number over the phone and told Hayes to dig into every corner of the boy's financial life. I needed numbers, ledgers, and buried secrets. I spent the next few hours reviewing my own accounts, shifting liquid assets into secured holding trusts. If Brent was plotting to siphon my daughter's wealth, I had to ensure the well was dry on my end. Right at noon, my encrypted line rang. Hayes did not waste time with pleasantries. He delivered a financial autopsy that confirmed my darkest suspicions. Brent was not a successful finance executive. He was a sinking ship strapped to an anchor. He had leveraged his entire personal portfolio and illegally borrowed against his firm's capital to invest in a massive cryptocurrency scheme. The scheme collapsed entirely 3 months ago. Brent was $2 million in the hole. He was dodging aggressive creditors and facing imminent personal bankruptcy in exactly 60 days. The timeline clicked perfectly into place. His sudden rush to push the wedding forward, his desperate need to access Naomi's accounts, all of it was a calculated scramble for a lifeline. He was planning to use my daughter's inheritance to pay off his catastrophic failures. I thanked Hayes and hung up the phone. A cold, calculated calm settled over me. Brent was a cornered animal, which made him dangerous but also entirely predictable. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway interrupted my thoughts. I looked out the window to see Naomi rushing out of her car. She walked into the house with her shoulders slumped, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I met her in the kitchen and handed her a glass of water. She sat at the island counter, her hands shaking slightly. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my tone perfectly steady. She broke down completely. Between heavy sobs, she confessed that she and Brent had fought all night about the wedding venue. Naomi had originally wanted a simple ceremony at our local church, surrounded by the community she grew up with. But Brent had planted a deeply toxic idea in her head. He convinced her that a public wedding would invite cruel judgment from his elite status-obsessed colleagues. He told my daughter that her plus-size figure would be heavily scrutinized by the thin, superficial wives of his finance partners. He whispered these cruelties under the guise of wanting to protect her. He manipulated her deep-seated insecurities, the very same childhood wounds I had spent decades trying to heal. He told her she needed a secluded, highly exclusive private villa to feel truly safe on her wedding day. The deposit for this private fortress was exactly $100,000 a sum. He claimed his funds could not cover right now due to a temporary market freeze. He had twisted my beautiful daughter into a state of total emotional panic, weaponizing her own body image to extract my cash. He made her believe that hiding her away was an act of profound love. I watched the tears roll down her cheeks. My chest tightened with a protective rage so fierce it tasted like copper in my mouth. He was destroying her self-esteem piece by piece just to balance his hidden ledger. I placed my hand over hers and told her to dry her tears. I promised her she would have the exact wedding she deserved. I looked Naomi straight in the eyes and told her the $100,000 was hers. Her face immediately brightened, and she threw her arms around my neck, thanking me profusely. I hugged her back, feeling the trembling in her shoulders subside. But as she pulled away, I held up a single finger. I told her there was one absolute condition. I explained that a man who built a shipping empire from the ground up never hands over raw cash without a strict paper trail. I would fund the villa entirely, but I would pay the vendors directly from my own accounts. Furthermore, Brent had to sign a formal, legally binding cost acknowledgement form. I framed it as a standard family tax procedure, a simple formality to keep the IRS off my back regarding large gift disbursements. Naomi did not question it for a second. She was just relieved the crisis was averted. She kissed my cheek, grabbed her purse, and rushed out the door to share the good news with her loving fiancé. She had absolutely no idea she was delivering the first piece of bait straight into his waiting jaws. I watched her car disappear down the street. The house fell silent once more. I walked back to my office and poured myself a glass of bourbon. I needed Brent to sign that specific document because Hayes had drafted it with a hidden mechanism designed to spring shut the moment Brent made a mistake. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was a secure text message from Hayes. I opened the notification. It contained a single high-definition photograph taken from across a busy street. The image showed Brent stepping out of a cheap run-down motel on the edge of the city limits. He was hurriedly buttoning his suit jacket. Clinging to his arm was a blonde woman in a tight dress, her face buried in his shoulder as they walked toward his newly leased Mercedes. My daughter was crying over her body image, believing this man was trying to protect her, while he was spending his afternoon in a filthy motel room with another woman. I locked my phone screen. The game was no longer just about protecting my assets. It was about complete and total annihilation. The crisp blue edge of the cashier's check peeked out from beneath my ceramic coffee mug. $100,000. I invited Naomi and Brent over for a home-cooked Friday dinner serving smothered pork chops and collard greens. Brent sat across from me picking at his food, his eyes constantly darting back to the slip of paper. He cleared his throat, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and put on his best corporate negotiation voice. He suggested that dealing with private villa vendors could be a logistical nightmare for a retired man like myself. He smoothly offered to have the funds wired directly into his and Naomi's joint checking account, claiming his firm's premium banking tier would expedite the international transfers. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I placed my mug down and looked him dead in the eye. I told him that in the freight business you never hand over a shipping container without controlling the bill of lading. I explained my absolute rule. I hold the capital, therefore I control the destination. I would cut the checks directly to the catering company, the florists, and the estate manager. Naomi stopped eating and nodded in immediate agreement. She told Brent that my method was the safest way to avoid hidden international wire fees, completely missing the underlying tension at the table. Brent's jaw tightened. The polished smile on his face cracked for a fraction of a second, exposing the desperate cornered man underneath. He realized he could not push the issue without appearing blatantly greedy in front of my daughter. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table alongside a heavy steel pen. I told him it was a standard cost acknowledgement form, a simple necessity for my personal tax records regarding large gift disbursements. I framed it as a boring formality to keep the federal auditors off my back. Brent snatched the pen. His desperation to secure the venue and keep up his wealthy facade overrode any basic caution. He hastily scribbled his signature at the bottom of the page, sliding it back to me with a forced chuckle. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed away his entire future. Brent did not bother to read the fine print. He assumed I was just a blue-collar relic, an uneducated old man obsessed with outdated tax receipts. His arrogance blinded him entirely to the lethal precision of the document now resting in my hands. Hayes had drafted that specific contract with the meticulous care of a surgeon preparing to amputate a diseased limb. On the surface, the paper appeared to be a standard liability waiver required by the private villa to cover potential property damage during the wedding reception. But buried deep within the third paragraph of the legal jargon was a severe moral turpitude clause. Hayes had designed it to activate under very specific conditions. The clause explicitly stated that if the wedding was canceled prior to the ceremony due to documented infidelity, criminal fraud, or severe moral misconduct by the groom, Brent would be held personally and solely liable for the entire cost of the event. Furthermore, the contract included a punitive damages multiplier. If Brent caused the cancellation through his own betrayal, he was legally bound to refund me double the initial amount, $200,000. By signing that paper, Brent had placed his head squarely inside a legal guillotine. He thought he was merely humoring a paranoid old man. In reality, he had just legally weaponized my bank account against himself. I folded the document carefully and slipped it into my inner jacket pocket. I offered him a warm smile, congratulating him on securing the perfect location for my daughter. I watched him drink his wine, looking completely relaxed, entirely unaware that the ticking clock on his destruction had just grown significantly louder. I felt a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. The trap was locked. Now I simply needed to gather the ammunition to pull the trigger. Later that evening, after they left, my encrypted phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. Hayes had finished running the license plates from the motel photograph. He sent me a detailed file containing everything I needed to know. The blonde woman was not a random encounter. Her name was Vanessa. Hayes provided her home address, her workplace, and a detailed schedule of her movements. I grabbed my keys. It was time to see exactly how my future son-in-law spent his stolen time. The next afternoon, the heavy sun beat down relentlessly on the asphalt of a high-end apartment complex on the north side of the city. I parked my rusted, faded blue Ford truck between two large delivery vans, effectively vanishing into the background. I rolled the windows down slightly to let the stifling heat escape and waited in the shadows of the cab. According to the dossier Hayes provided, Vanessa lived in a luxury suite that commanded a rent far beyond her means as a part-time yoga instructor. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, a gleaming, midnight black Mercedes glided into the visitor parking zone. The car was brand new. Naomi had purchased it for him just 2 months ago as an early wedding gift, convinced by Brent that a man in his financial position needed to project a certain image to attract high-net-worth clients. Brent stepped out of the luxury vehicle, adjusting his designer sunglasses. Almost simultaneously, a premium grocery delivery van pulled up directly behind him. The driver unloaded 4 massive paper bags overflowing with expensive organic produce, imported cheeses, and top-shelf liquor. Brent approached the driver casually. I raised my camera, zooming in tightly on his hands through the windshield. I watched through the lens as Brent pulled a sleek silver credit card from his wallet and handed it to the delivery driver to cover the hefty tip and final processing fees. I recognized the card instantly. It was the joint account debit card linked directly to Naomi's primary savings. My blood turned to ice, followed by a surge of pure calculated hostility. He was using the money my daughter earned through late nights at her architecture firm to feed and entertain his secret mistress. Brent grabbed 2 of the heavy grocery bags and headed toward the glass entrance of the building, laughing into his phone. Vanessa appeared at the lobby door wearing expensive workout clothes and greeted him with a passionate kiss. I kept the camera rolling, documenting every second of the sickening display. I did not honk my horn. I did not jump out to confront them. I sat perfectly still, letting the evidence accumulate. The more comfortable he felt, the harder he would fall. I started the engine quietly. Tomorrow he would come to my house with demands, and I would be ready. I stepped out of the sweltering cab of my Ford and moved silently across the hot asphalt. Decades of inspecting loading docks at midnight had taught me how to walk without making a single sound. I slipped behind a massive concrete pillar just 10 feet from where Brent and his blonde companion stood. The girl Vanessa crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Her face was flushed with anger. She slapped the hood of the new Mercedes Naomi had bought him. She demanded to know how much longer she had to remain a secret while he paraded around town playing house. Brent grabbed her wrists, pulling her close, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I slid my phone out of my pocket and hit record. The audio captured every toxic word perfectly. Vanessa sneered, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. She told Brent to hurry up and marry the fat cow so they could finally cash out. My vision went red. The urge to step around the pillar and crush his windpipe was a physical weight in my chest. I forced my breathing to slow. Brent stroked Vanessa's hair and made a promise that sealed his ultimate fate. He told her she only had to wait 3 more months. He explained that once the marriage certificate was filed, he would have direct, unmitigated access to Naomi's accounts and the family trust. He promised Vanessa he would transfer the funds, offshore divorce Naomi, and fly the two of them straight to Europe. They kissed a desperate, greedy exchange before getting into the Mercedes and driving away. I stood alone in the parking garage, the recording safely stored in my encrypted cloud drive. The trap was no longer just about protecting my wealth. It was about surgically removing a parasite before it could drain the life from my daughter. I walked back to my truck, my mind cold and entirely focused on the mechanics of his destruction. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, the air conditioning blasting against my face, and played the recording back. Vanessa's cruel words echoed through the quiet cabin. I looked at the dashboard, wrestling with the most primal instinct of a protective father. The easiest move would be to drive straight to Naomi's house, kick down the door, and play the audio. But the easiest move in business usually leads to a systemic failure. Naomi was desperately in love with an illusion. If I dropped this bomb on her now, the sheer emotional shock would shatter her spirit. Brent would immediately pivot to damage control. He would claim the audio was doctored, generated by artificial intelligence, or completely taken out of context. He would manipulate her deepest insecurities, convince her I was a controlling tyrant trying to sabotage her happiness out of jealousy, and successfully force a wedge between us. Naomi had to see the monster herself, completely unmasked under her own terms. I locked the phone and dialed Hayes. He answered on the first ring. I gave him a new directive. I needed absolute control over Vanessa's environment. I told Hayes to immediately set up an anonymous shell corporation and execute a commercial lease on the vacant retail space located directly beneath Vanessa's luxury apartment. The property manager had been desperate to fill that unit for months. By securing that lease as commercial tenants, we gained legal access to the building's security infrastructure, the parking logs, and the internal surveillance feeds. I told Hayes to wire the funds today and spare no expense. We were no longer just monitoring Brent. We were building an invisible cage around his entire secret life. Hayes confirmed the wire transfer and promised the commercial lease would be fully executed within 24 hours. I hung up the phone and shifted the truck into drive. I knew Brent would soon realize the implications of the wedding venue contract he had signed. When a rat feels cornered, it lashes out. I drove home, preparing my mind for his next inevitable move. Later that evening, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent house. I opened it to find Brent standing on my porch. The slick, agreeable persona he wore at the engagement party was entirely gone. His posture was rigid, his jaw set with an arrogant defiance. He marched past me into my study without waiting for an invitation. He stood in front of my mahogany desk, refusing to sit down in the guest chair. He launched directly into a rehearsed, aggressive speech. He stated that he and Naomi had been discussing their financial future and he had come to set some firm boundaries. He demanded that I completely abandon any idea of forcing a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. He claimed that demanding a financial contract from a successful white finance executive was deeply offensive. He weaponized social politics right in my study, arguing that my insistence on protecting my assets was a racist, classist insult against his professional integrity. He looked me straight in the eye and said my old-school working-class paranoia was toxic to my daughter's modern relationship. He told me that if I truly respected Naomi as an independent woman, I would let them merge their assets freely without my heavy-handed interference. The sheer audacity of a man drowning in $2 million of hidden debt. Lecturing me about financial integrity was breathtaking. I did not raise my voice. I did not call him a fraud or a thief. I walked over to my crystal decanter and poured 2 glasses of neat bourbon. I handed one to him, my expression completely serene. I took a slow sip, letting the burning liquid coat my throat. I looked at this desperate, pathetic man trying to bully a veteran of the freight industry. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that he completely misinterpreted as surrender. I told him he made a very compelling argument and that a traditional prenup was off the table. The bait was floating right in front of his face, and he was swimming directly toward the hook. I watched the tension leave Brent's shoulders the moment the words left my mouth. He took a generous swallow of the bourbon, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He believed he had successfully intimidated an old man using nothing but aggressive social posturing. I leaned back in my leather chair and told him I completely understood his perspective. I admitted that a standard prenuptial agreement could indeed feel adversarial and cold. I told him I wanted this marriage to be built on absolute trust and mutual partnership. Brent nodded enthusiastically, adopting a posture of fake humility, thanking me for finally seeing reason. That is when I opened my center desk drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I slid it across the polished mahogany surface toward him. I explained that instead of a prenup, I had instructed my legal team to draft a closed family trust. I told him this structure would name both him and Naomi as equal, co-managing beneficiaries to a substantial portion of my liquid assets. I watched his eyes track the gold lettering on the portfolio. The sheer naked greed radiating from him was palpable. His breathing actually hitched for a fraction of a second. I explained that this trust would serve as their ultimate financial safety net, ensuring they would never face a single hardship, allowing them to draw from a shared pool of wealth for major life investments like a new commercial property or future children. I could practically see the gears turning in his head behind his perfectly groomed exterior. In his mind, he had just bypassed a locked door and been handed the master keys to the vault. He was already calculating how quickly he could siphon those funds to satisfy his massive hidden cryptocurrency debts and fund his escape to Europe with Vanessa. He adopted a grave, respectful tone, telling me he was honored by my incredible generosity and my faith in his leadership as the future head of our household. I maintained a warm, fatherly expression, never letting my smile falter. I told him it was the absolute least I could do for the man who promised to protect my only daughter. I offered Brent a heavy silver pen, the exact same one he had used to sign the venue liability waiver just days prior. I casually suggested that he take the portfolio home and have his own legal counsel review the trust documents before signing, adding a gentle reassurance that there was absolutely no rush. It was a highly calculated bluff. I knew from Hayes's detailed financial autopsy that Brent was completely broke. He did not have the retainer fee required to hire a corporate attorney capable of deciphering Hayes's labyrinthine legal structures. Brent waved off my suggestion, instantly eager to lock in his prize. He claimed that bringing outside lawyers into a private family matter would only complicate things and ruin the beautiful spirit of mutual trust we had just established. He flipped eagerly to the back of the thick portfolio and signed his name on the dotted line with a flourish. He did not bother to read the 50 pages of dense stipulations preceding his signature. If he had, he would have discovered the lethal mechanism Hayes had engineered specifically for his unique situation. The document was not a standard wealth distribution trust. It contained an aggressive self-executing protection clause regarding premarital financial liabilities. By signing, Brent legally swore that he carried no undisclosed debts exceeding $50,000. The clause dictated that if any hidden catastrophic debt was discovered after the marriage, it would be classified as a direct hostile threat to the trust's integrity. Under this specific legal framework, the trust was automatically granted supreme authorization to initiate an immediate, merciless seizure of the debtor's personal property to insulate the core assets. Brent had just legally authorized me to strip him absolutely bare without a trial. I took the portfolio back and carefully placed it into my heavy wall safe, locking it with a loud mechanical click. Brent finished his bourbon, shook my hand firmly, and walked out of my study with the swagger of a newly minted millionaire. I stood by the window and watched him drive away in the Mercedes my daughter bought him. He was a dead man, walking completely unaware that he had just fastened a golden noose tightly around his own neck. 3 weeks later, the day of the wedding arrived, bathed in the brilliant sunlight of the secluded coastal villa I had paid for. The estate was heavily guarded by private security, completely isolated from the outside world, just as Brent had demanded to hide Naomi away. White floral arrangements cascaded down the grand stone staircase, and a string quartet played softly in the background, creating a picture-perfect illusion. I stood in the grand foyer adjusting the cuffs of my tailored tuxedo. Naomi stepped out of the bridal suite, taking my breath away. She looked radiant, her emerald eyes shining with absolute joy, entirely free of the toxic insecurities Brent had ruthlessly exploited for months. She took my arm, and I felt a heavy, agonizing weight settle deep in my chest. We walked slowly down the long, white carpet runner toward the altar. The ocean breeze caught her intricate veil. 100 smiling faces turned to watch us, ignorant of the quiet war raging beneath the beautiful surface. I looked straight ahead at Brent, waiting beneath the towering floral arch. He wore a custom tuxedo projecting the flawless image of a devoted, successful groom. I knew with absolute certainty that I was handing my only child over to a manipulative monster. The protective father inside me screamed to stop the ceremony, to drag her away from the altar and expose his vile parking lot argument with Vanessa right then and there. But I kept my steps measured and my face perfectly composed. Breaking her heart today in front of a crowd would destroy her entirely, leaving her with a massive public humiliation she might never recover from. She needed to see his mask slip on her own terms in her own time. I reached the altar, kissed my daughter softly on the cheek, and placed her hand securely in Brent's waiting palm. I retreated to my seat in the front row. I watched them exchange golden rings and recite their hollow vows, listening to Brent lie effortlessly before God and our entire family. I did not flinch. I simply touched the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket, feeling the cold, hard outline of my encrypted mobile phone. I possessed the undeniable audio proof of his infidelity and the signed legal detonator to his entire existence. The ceremony concluded with a passionate kiss, and the crowd erupted in joyful applause. The trap was now fully operational. The reception pulsed with the heavy bass of a live jazz band, while crystal flutes clinked under the warm glow of string lights. Waiters weaved seamlessly through the crowd, pouring endless streams of expensive champagne. The private coastal villa had been transformed into a massive, opulent playground. Brent embraced the open bar with reckless enthusiasm. His polished, gentlemanly groom persona began to melt away rapidly, replaced by the sloppy, unrestrained arrogance of a man who believed he had just successfully robbed a bank. I stood quietly near the edge of the mahogany bar, nursing a single glass of sparkling water and watching the room with the practiced eye of a predator. Brent stumbled over to my corner. His face flushed a deep, unhealthy red from the liquor. He leaned heavily against the polished wood of the bar counter, effectively trapping me in the corner. He did not bother lowering his voice or looking around to see who might be listening. He looked down at my hands resting on the marble top. He laughed a wet, ugly sound and pointed directly at the thick calluses on my palms that 40 years of hauling freight and gripping steering wheels had left behind. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his breath reeking of expensive gin and sour ambition. He told me it was absolutely hilarious how the world worked. He bragged, a smug smirk stretching across his sweating face, that a working-class black man from the south side of Chicago had just shelled out an absolute fortune to buy a white finance executive for a son-in-law. He framed the entire wedding as my desperate, pathetic attempt to buy high society prestige for my daughter. My jaw locked tight. The sheer audacity of his racism and classism was staggering. He was openly mocking the very hands that were actively funding the liquor he was currently drowning in. I did not throw my drink in his face. I did not signal the private security guard standing by the exit to drag him out. I simply looked at his flushed face, maintaining an absolutely deadpan expression. I raised my glass of water in a mock toast. I congratulated him on his massive victory. I told him he had played a brilliant game and secured his prize perfectly. He chuckled, completely missing the lethal underlying threat in my words, and stumbled back toward the dance floor to parade his newly acquired wealth. He thought my silence was a sign of submissive defeat. He had absolutely no idea it was an execution order. The extravagant reception finally wound down around midnight. The exhausted guests filtered out to the waiting line of town cars, and the newlyweds retreated to the lavish master honeymoon suite on the top floor of the villa. I drove back to my quiet, empty house. I did not go to sleep. I walked directly into my study, turned on my desktop computer, and brought up the secure banking portal. When I established the closed family trust, I made sure my financial team embedded strict monitoring protocols across all accounts connected to Naomi. I sat alone in the dark, watching the glowing screen of my monitor. At exactly 2 a.m, the heavy silence of my office was broken by a sharp chime from my mobile phone. A high-priority banking alert flashed across the screen. I refreshed the secure portal immediately. $15,000 had just been authorized for transfer out of Naomi's personal savings account. The destination routing number belonged to an obscure, unregulated, offshore cryptocurrency exchange. The digital footprint was sloppy, executed with the frantic haste of a man desperate to silence his underground loan sharks. Brent could not even wait 24 hours to begin stealing from his new wife. He had waited until Naomi fell deeply asleep on their wedding night to quietly slip out of bed, access her unlocked phone or laptop, and siphon her hard-earned savings into his black hole of debt. I watched the digital transaction shift from pending to processing. I had the power to freeze the transfer with a single phone call to my private banking concierge. I could have stopped the theft right there in its tracks, but stopping a $15,000 theft would only alert him to my heavy surveillance. It would prompt a heated argument, a fake apology, and a renewed effort to hide his tracks moving forward. I needed him to feel completely unobserved and invincible. I needed him to steal more to trigger the larger trap. I let the transaction clear. The money vanished into the digital void. Brent was blindly pulling the lever on the mechanism I had built for him. The sun was barely up the next morning when my phone rang. It was Naomi. I answered immediately, bracing myself for the devastation I knew would be in her voice. She did not sound like a glowing new bride waking up in a luxury villa on her first day of marriage. Her voice was trembling tight with unshed tears and sheer, overwhelming panic. She asked me a rapid series of disorganized questions about how corporate bank security protocols functioned, specifically inquiring how long it typically took to reverse fraudulent international charges. She was trying desperately to hide her panic, attempting to frame the tense conversation as a casual curiosity about finance. I kept my voice incredibly soft and reassuring. I asked her to slow down and tell me exactly what had happened. She broke down, completely admitting that she had checked her banking app that morning to pay the final makeup artist invoice, only to find $15,000 missing from her personal savings. She stammered out a chaotic explanation. She told me Brent had been awake long before her, urgently managing some sudden tech glitches with his own accounts on his laptop. Brent had firmly convinced her that her bank had experienced a massive security breach overnight. He was actively gaslighting her, spinning a wild, terrifying narrative about international hackers targeting the vulnerable accounts of newly married couples. He had completely manipulated her into believing it was a systemic bank error and fiercely instructed her not to call the official fraud department yet. He claimed his elite finance buddies could trace the funds much faster without alerting the slow, incompetent authorities. He was buying time to cover his tracks and isolate her from professional help. I listened to my daughter choke back sobs on the first morning of her marriage. He was breaking her reality to protect his blatant theft. I did not tell her the truth. I did not tell her that her new husband was the hacker draining her accounts. A sudden brutal revelation would only push her further into his manipulative grip. I told her to take a deep breath and let me handle the bank executives on her behalf. I promised her she would not lose a single dime. She thanked me, her voice small and fragile. I hung up the phone. The time for passive observation was officially over. Brent had drawn first blood directly from my daughter. It was time to pull the golden noose tight around his neck. Naomi arrived at my front door just before noon on a Tuesday. She looked entirely exhausted, her usual vibrant energy drained completely from her posture. She dropped her purse on the entryway table and walked straight into the kitchen, staring blankly at the marble countertops. She told me Brent was supposedly at his luxury gym working out with his senior partners. I poured her a cup of herbal tea and waited in absolute silence. I knew she would speak when the pressure inside her became too heavy to bear. Finally, she buried her face in her hands and began to cry. She confessed that their joint checking account was bleeding money at an alarming rate. She had logged in to pay their monthly utility bills and discovered that tens of thousands of dollars had vanished over the past 3 weeks. Brent had offered her a chaotic, convoluted excuse about aggressively investing in short-term foreign currencies to build their future nest egg. He had assured her the money would bounce back with a massive return. I did not raise my voice, and I absolutely did not attack Brent. A direct assault would only trigger her defensive instincts and push her back into his arms. Instead, I employed a classic corporate starvation tactic. I offered her a perfectly logical, emotionally detached business solution. I told my daughter that keeping large sums of liquid cash in a standard joint checking account was a terrible financial strategy. I gently reminded her about the closed family trust we had established just before the wedding. I suggested she move all her remaining liquid assets directly into the trust to earn a substantially higher institutional yield. I assured her that my private wealth advisors would lock the funds in a secure high-interest bond, keeping the money perfectly safe from market volatility and accessible whenever she truly needed it for a major purchase. The logic was utterly flawless. Naomi wiped her tears, pulled her smartphone from her pocket, and opened her banking application right there at my kitchen island. With 3 simple taps on the glass screen, she transferred her entire life savings into the ironclad vault of the family trust. The trap snapped shut. Her personal accounts hit zero, effectively cutting off the parasite's absolute lifeblood. Less than 2 hours later, my secure phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted transmission from Hayes's lead investigator. The investigator was currently stationed inside a high-end luxury jewelry boutique downtown, casually browsing watches near the front entrance. I opened the live video feed from his concealed lapel camera. The high-definition footage showed Brent standing at the gleaming glass counter alongside Vanessa. His mistress was practically vibrating with excitement, pointing a manicured finger at a massive diamond tennis bracelet resting on a black velvet display pad. Brent leaned against the counter, exuding the smug confidence of a man spending someone else's fortune. He nodded to the sales clerk, loudly declaring that he would take it. He pulled out the dark blue debit card linked directly to Naomi's newly emptied joint account. He handed it to the clerk without a single second thought, fully expecting the transaction to clear instantly, just as it had for the past month. The clerk inserted the card into the terminal. A sharp negative beep echoed through the quiet boutique. The clerk frowned, tapped the screen, and tried the card a second time. The machine flashed a bright red decline notification. The clerk slid the card back across the glass, maintaining a polite, professional tone, as he informed Brent that the bank had refused the authorization due to insufficient funds. Brent froze completely. The color instantly drained from his face as he stared at the little plastic rectangle. Vanessa let out a sharp gasp of sheer indignation. She demanded to know if this was some kind of sick joke. Brent stammered, pulling out his cell phone to frantically check the banking app, but his access had already been restricted by the sudden zero balance transfer. Vanessa did not wait for his pathetic excuses. She threw a massive, humiliating public tantrum right in the middle of the quiet store. She screamed that he was a broke, lying fraud and hurled her expensive leather clutch at his chest. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the boutique, leaving Brent standing entirely alone under the harsh, unforgiving lights of the jewelry counter. The investigator captured every agonizing second of his public emasculation. The parasite had officially been starved of his host. The financial reality crashed down on Brent with the force of a speeding freight train. He rushed back to their luxury apartment, completely abandoning his sophisticated, gentlemanly facade. I listened to the aftermath through a frantic phone call from Naomi less than an hour later. She told me Brent had burst through their front door, screaming like a madman. He had completely bypassed his usual manipulative charm and immediately demanded to know where the absolute hell all the money from their joint account had gone. Naomi, entirely innocent and perfectly calm, repeated the exact financial script I had given her in my kitchen. She explained that she had consulted with me regarding inflation and decided to move her remaining liquid assets into the closed family trust for ultimate safety and maximum yield. The words hit Brent like a physical blow. He realized instantly that the money was now locked behind the very legal document he had so eagerly signed without reading. His secret funding source was completely dead. The sheer panic of his impending bankruptcy and his massive looming debts finally shattered his composure. In a state of blind, uncontrolled rage, Brent picked up a heavy crystal vase from the entryway table and hurled it violently across the room. The vase shattered against the hardwood floor, sending sharp shards of glass flying in every direction. Naomi told me her heart stopped. She had never seen this violent, unhinged version of the man she had just married. He was practically foaming at the mouth, his face twisted into a mask of pure desperation and hatred. He realized he could not legally touch a single cent of the trust without triggering a full financial audit. Terrified by his explosive violence, Naomi locked herself inside the guest bedroom and dialed my number, crying silently into the receiver. I told her to stay exactly where she was and promised her that everything was entirely under my control. At that exact moment, a separate notification chimed on my mobile phone. It was a text message from Brent. The text lacked any polite greeting or basic respect. It was a single aggressive sentence demanding that I meet him at a local coffee shop immediately. The cornered rat was finally turning to face the exterminator. I grabbed my keys, ready to deliver the next devastating blow. I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet, neon-lit diner on the edge of town. The rain had just started to fall, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. I stepped inside. The diner was completely empty except for a single waitress wiping down the counter and Brent sitting in a cracked vinyl booth at the far end. His expensive suit was wrinkled. The top button of his shirt was undone and his tie hung loosely around his neck. The moment I slid into the booth across from him, he slammed both of his hands flat onto the sticky laminate table. The silverware rattled violently against the porcelain plates. He completely dropped the polished, respectful son-in-law facade he had worn for the past year. His face was twisted in an ugly sneer. He demanded that I immediately authorize the release of Naomi's funds from the family trust. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with absolute venom, and called me an ignorant old man. He told me I was a dinosaur who built a little trucking company in the dark ages and possessed absolutely no understanding of modern liquidity or high-speed market fluctuations. He claimed I was financially suffocating him and Naomi out of sheer paranoid spite. In the early days of my shipping company, I faced down corrupt dock foremen who carried loaded weapons in their jackets. A kid in a synthetic suit slamming his hands on a diner table was not going to raise my pulse. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or react to his pathetic insults. I picked up the thick ceramic mug of black coffee the waitress had left for me and took a slow, deliberate sip. The bitter heat grounded me. I set the mug down and reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a glossy, heavy document folder and slid it smoothly across the table until it touched his white knuckles. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. I told him my methods were old school, which is exactly why I never let capital sit idle in a bank account losing value to inflation. I instructed him to open the folder. He snatched it up, his eyes darting across the pages. It was a completely fabricated, highly detailed commercial real estate portfolio that Hayes had assembled that very afternoon. It displayed a massive multi-million-dollar acquisition of prime warehouse space in the industrial district. Brent stared at the glossy pages, his eyes wide and unblinking. He read the fabricated acquisition summaries, the fake escrow deposits, and the legally binding transfer timelines. I folded my hands on the table and explained the situation with total corporate detachment. I told him that acting on his earlier advice about maximizing yield, I had successfully executed a massive leverage strategy. I informed him that every single liquid asset in the closed family trust, including the entirety of Naomi's transferred savings, was now fully committed to this commercial real estate buyout. The funds were legally locked in escrow for the next 6 months while the property zoning cleared. I stated clearly that absolutely no withdrawals were possible under any circumstances without incurring millions in federal penalty fees and violating our contract. The arrogant sneer melted off his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified child. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He dropped the folder onto the table as if it had physically burned his fingers. 6 months. He repeated the words in a hollow, trembling whisper. His underground creditors were not going to wait 6 months. They had explicitly given him a hard deadline of this coming Friday to cover the massive margin call on his collapsed crypto scheme. He ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair, completely ruining the gelled look. The polished finance executive shattered right in front of my eyes. His shoulders slumped forward heavily. He covered his face with his hands, letting out a pathetic, stifled sob that echoed in the empty diner. He begged me to find a loophole. He pleaded with me to pull strings, call my bankers, or do whatever it took to free up some cash immediately. When I maintained my cold silence, his desperation reached a fever pitch. He looked at me with red, watery eyes and begged for a personal off-the-books loan. He asked for exactly $500,000. He promised he would pay me back with massive interest the second his own market position stabilized. He was actively begging the man he had just called an ignorant dinosaur to save his life. I sat back in the vinyl booth and let him sweat in the heavy silence for a full minute. I watched a single bead of perspiration roll down his temple. Finally, I nodded slowly. I told him I would authorize the personal loan of $500,000 to help him through his temporary liquidity crisis. He let out a massive sigh of relief, reaching across the table to grasp my hand. I pulled my hand back sharply. I reminded him that I am a man of logistics and I never extend a line of credit without securing hard collateral. I reached into my briefcase a second time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I demanded a total unconditional lien on his entire proprietary tech startup. I knew his startup was nothing more than a hollow shell company he used to funnel money, but legally, it was his only remaining asset on paper. Brent barely even glanced at the terms. His sheer desperation to secure the cash blinded him to basic survival instincts. He practically ripped his expensive fountain pen from his breast pocket and signed his name at the bottom of the lien agreement. He pushed the paper back to me, swearing his absolute loyalty and gratitude. He was completely unaware that less than an hour ago, Hayes had transmitted a massive anonymous digital dossier directly to the fraud division of the IRS. The dossier contained every hidden ledger, every illegal crypto transfer, and every tax evasion strategy Brent had ever executed. I folded the signed lien and tucked it safely into my briefcase alongside the fake real estate portfolio. I pulled out my phone, opened my secure banking application, and authorized the $500,000 wire transfer directly into his primary account. I turned the screen around to show him the green confirmation checkmark. He wept with profound relief, thanking me profusely as he stood up to leave the diner. He rushed out into the pouring rain, sprinting toward his luxury Mercedes. I sat alone in the quiet diner, finishing my bitter black coffee. I knew the wire transfer would successfully leave my account, but I also knew with absolute certainty that it would never reach his hands. The federal trap was already snapping shut. Tuesday morning broke with a heavy, oppressive humidity that hung over the city. Brent sat in his glass-walled corner office, entirely ignoring the mounting pile of corporate reports on his desk. His bloodshot eyes were glued to the screen of his smartphone. He constantly refreshed his primary banking application, waiting for the $500,000 lifeline to officially clear. The transaction history showed the incoming wire transfer from my account sitting in a precarious pending status. He tapped the screen with a trembling finger, muttering under his breath. At exactly 9 o'clock, the banking server updated. The pending status vanished. It was instantly replaced by a stark, flashing red notification. The screen blared a terrifying message, frozen by federal order. Brent stopped breathing. He frantically tapped the notification, attempting to force the interface to load his available balance. A secondary alert popped up, informing him that the Internal Revenue Service Fraud Division had initiated a comprehensive immediate lockdown of all his connected financial assets pending a high-level criminal investigation. His entire digital wallet, his offshore routing numbers, and his domestic checking accounts were completely paralyzed. He was locked out of his own life. The walls of his pristine office suddenly felt like a shrinking cage. He logged into his laptop, desperately trying to route funds through a secondary shell company, but the federal freeze had spread like a virus, infecting every single node of his financial network. My digital dossier had mapped his entire illegal infrastructure with surgical precision. The crushing reality of his situation set in. He had handed over the legal rights to his tech startup to me, and the IRS had confiscated his cash flow. He possessed absolutely nothing. The silence of the office was shattered by his mobile phone violently vibrating against the glass desk. He looked at the caller identification. It was not his banking representative. It was a blocked number belonging to the underground creditors he owed. The Friday deadline was no longer a threat. It was a looming execution. The phone rang incessantly, a relentless demand for money he could no longer access. He rejected the call, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. He stared at his reflection in the dark monitor, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking together in his panicked mind. He realized the diner meeting, the fake real estate portfolio, and the perfectly timed federal freeze were not a string of terrible luck. It was a perfectly orchestrated slaughter, and I was the architect. Brent exploded out of his office building and sprinted toward the parking garage. He drove his Mercedes through the city streets like a manic fugitive, swerving through heavy traffic and running red lights in a blind panic. He pulled up to my property, throwing the vehicle into park with the engine still roaring. He marched up my front steps, his polished veneer completely destroyed. He began kicking the heavy oak of my front door with the heel of his expensive loafer, screaming my name. I stood in the foyer adjusting my watch and allowed him to kick the wood 3 more times before I calmly turned the brass handle and pulled the door open. Brent almost fell forward onto the tile. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Spittle flew from his lips as he aggressively pointed a finger an inch from my face. He accused me of hacking his servers and setting him up with the federal authorities. He screamed that I had deliberately orchestrated the IRS freeze to ruin his life and sabotage his legitimate business operations. He demanded that I call my lawyers and reverse the federal lock immediately. I did not flinch. I looked at his sweating, frantic face and maintained a posture of absolute corporate detachment. I calmly informed him that playing fast and loose with underground cryptocurrency carries severe occupational hazards. I told him that hard business requires intense due diligence, and he had simply failed to cover his tracks. Before he could unleash another torrent of screaming accusations, a familiar car turned into the driveway. Naomi parked her sedan directly behind his idling Mercedes. She stepped out of the vehicle, freezing as she absorbed the chaotic scene on the porch. She witnessed her new husband, red-faced, screaming wildly and acting like an unhinged lunatic. She walked slowly up the front pathway, her voice small and filled with confusion, asking him what on earth was going on. Brent snapped his head toward her. His eyes were wild, completely devoid of any remaining affection or manipulative charm. He realized in that split second that the money was gone, the facade was useless, and he was entirely cornered. His survival instinct abandoned him, replaced by a vicious, destructive fury. He turned his full, terrifying rage away from me and focused it entirely on his new bride. Brent marched down the front steps, closing the distance between him and Naomi. He stood over her in the driveway, completely abandoning the gentle, loving persona he had weaponized for the past year. He unleashed every ounce of his hidden venom directly into her face. He screamed that she was absolutely nothing without my money. His voice echoed down the quiet suburban street, dripping with horrific cruelty. He explicitly called her a useless fat pig. He shouted that every single moment he spent touching her or pretending to care about her was a repulsive chore he only endured to get his hands on her father's bank account. He completely laid bare his ultimate parasitic nature, admitting proudly that he never loved her and only viewed her as a pathetic, insecure vehicle to clear his debts. My vision went entirely red. The primal urge to step off the porch, grab him by the throat, and violently end his life surged through my muscles. My hands balled into tight fists, my knuckles turning white. I forced my feet to remain planted on the concrete. I did not strike him. I looked past his screaming face and locked my eyes squarely on Naomi. This was the brutal, necessary pain she had to endure. She had to hear the absolute truth from the monster's own mouth to permanently break the psychological spell he had cast over her. I watched the profound shock wash over her features. The devastating insult hung in the humid air. The illusion of her perfect marriage shattered violently, the pieces reflecting the cold, hard reality of his greed. She did not cry. The fear and confusion evaporated from her emerald eyes, replaced instantly by a chilling, deadened clarity. She finally saw the absolute void inside the man she had married. Without saying a single word, Naomi uncurled her fingers. Her designer purse dropped to the driveway, hitting the asphalt with a heavy thud. She stepped around him as if he were a piece of garbage blocking her path. She walked up the concrete steps past me and stepped into the quiet safety of my house. I slowly closed the heavy oak door, locking it with a loud, definitive click. Brent was left standing completely alone in the driveway. He stared at the closed door, the horrific realization of his total destruction washing over him. He let out a primal scream of defeat, kicked the tire of his Mercedes, and jumped into the driver's seat. He slammed the accelerator, peeling out of the driveway and burning rubber as he fled into the city. I guided Naomi past the heavy front doors and led her directly into the cold, silent sanctuary of my study. She stood motionless in the center of the room, her expensive designer wedding ring catching the fading afternoon light through the blinds. I did not offer her false comfort or meaningless platitudes about time healing broken hearts. She needed facts, not pity. I walked behind my polished mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and unlocked the encrypted drive. I told her clearly that there were fundamental truths she needed to understand about the man she had just married. I clicked on the audio file captured in the concrete parking garage weeks ago. The room instantly filled with Vanessa's sneering, vindictive voice, followed seamlessly by Brent's desperate, greedy promises. The phrase referring to her as a desperate fat cow echoed sharply against the wood-paneled walls. The recording detailed exactly how he planned to drain her family trust fund file for an aggressive divorce and flee straight to Europe with his mistress. I carefully watched Naomi's posture as the toxic, unapologetic words washed over her. She did not flinch. She did not break down, hyperventilate, or shed a single tear. Her spine straightened with absolute rigidity. I closed the audio file and opened the visual dossier Hayes had meticulously compiled. High-resolution photographs populated the large screen. Brent and Vanessa passionately kissing by his new Mercedes. Brent confidently purchasing expensive jewelry using her money. Brent walking into a downtown luxury hotel holding Vanessa's hand in broad daylight. I stood back and let the absolute, undeniable certainty of his betrayal sink deep into her bones. The terrified girl who had arrived at my doorstep an hour ago was completely gone. In her place stood a woman whose features had hardened into impenetrable stone. Her emerald eyes tracked every single pixel on the monitor, absorbing the mechanical, calculated precision of his deceit. I watched the final, lingering remnants of her marital illusion burn away, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity. She reached forward and closed the laptop herself. The quiet click of the closing screen sounded exactly like a judge's gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. She turned to face me, her expression flawlessly calm. The devastating emotional blow had not broken her spirit. It had forged it into tempered steel. I broke the heavy oppressive silence in the study, maintaining a perfectly level, detached tone. I told her I could have Hayes on a private jet back to the city by nightfall to handle the legal mechanics. I outlined the immediate logistical steps we could take to ensure her safety. We could file for an expedited, ruthless annulment based on explicit financial fraud, secure an ironclad restraining order to keep him away from our properties, and initiate a forceful, immediate eviction from their luxury apartment. I promised her Brent would be standing on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back before the banks even opened on Monday morning. I reached for my desk phone to give the execution order to my team. Naomi stepped forward and placed her hand firmly over mine, pressing the receiver slowly back into its cradle. She shook her head. Her gaze was terrifyingly serene, entirely devoid of the panic that had consumed her earlier that day. She told me that simply throwing him out onto the street was an entirely insufficient response to his crimes. She logically pointed out that letting him walk away empty-handed would only allow him to scurry back into the shadows, reinvent his slick corporate persona, and find another vulnerable, wealthy target to drain dry. She had inherited my meticulous logistical mind, and she was already analyzing the board several moves ahead of his greed. She categorically refused to be a passive victim rescued by her father's wealth. She demanded absolute systematic annihilation. Leaning against the edge of the mahogany desk, she outlined a brilliant, ruthless counteroffensive. She volunteered to walk right back into the lion's den tonight. She told me she would return to their apartment and perfectly play the role of the desperate, forgiving wife. She would swallow her pride, absorb his manic, cornered anger, and act as though his vicious driveway outburst had been a mutual misunderstanding born of extreme financial stress. She recognized that Brent was a desperate rat completely starved of capital and suffocating under the crushing weight of the federal freeze. By feeding his insatiable, blind greed, she could lead him directly into a final, inescapable trap. I looked at my daughter, feeling a profound surge of pride eclipse my paternal worry. We spent the next hour refining the exact architecture of his destruction. Naomi returned to their luxury apartment just as the city lights began to flicker on against the darkening sky. She found Brent pacing the living room floor like a caged animal, his knuckles white, staring obsessively at his frozen banking applications. The moment she walked through the front door, she deployed her performance flawlessly. She dropped her gaze, hunched her shoulders, and approached him with the perfect imitation of a submissive, deeply apologetic bride. She told him that she had fled to my house seeking comfort, but had instead engaged in a massive, screaming fight with me over his dire financial predicament. She convincingly claimed I had been a stubborn, unyielding tyrant who flatly refused to lift a single finger to help them out of their crisis. Brent's arrogant, self-righteous posture returned instantly. He sneered, eager to validate his intense hatred for me, and wrapped his arms around her, praising her for finally seeing my true toxic nature. Then, Naomi delivered the fatal bait. She pulled away slightly and lowered her voice to a frantic, conspiratorial whisper. She confessed that after our fabricated argument, I had stormed out of the house in a blind rage. She told him she had quietly slipped into my private study, bypassed the basic security on my desktop computer, and accessed my encrypted financial network. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a single handwritten slip of paper. She claimed it contained the direct digital access codes and routing numbers to a highly classified offshore retirement account holding exactly $5 million in untraceable liquid assets. She pressed the paper firmly into his trembling hands. She told him they could drain the account completely, abandon my oppressive control, and fly to Europe tonight to start their new life. Brent stared at the string of numbers, his pupils literally dilating with sheer narcotic greed. Any rational, logical thought processing instantly shut down in his brain. A competent financial executive would have questioned the incredible convenience of this sudden discovery. He would have analyzed the highly suspicious lack of dual authentication protocols on a massive corporate account. But Brent was not a competent executive. He was a drowning addict, gasping for a final breath of air. He swallowed the bait whole without a single moment of hesitation. He sprinted to his laptop to initiate the wire transfer, completely unaware the routing numbers were a direct pipeline into a monitored federal honeypot. Naomi settled onto the plush cushions of their living room sofa, pulling her sleek silver laptop onto her knees. Brent hovered immediately over her shoulder, his breath hot and shallow against her neck. His entire body was coiled tight with desperate anticipation. Naomi opened the web browser and navigated to the specific URL Hayes had provided earlier that afternoon. The screen loaded a stark, highly sophisticated banking portal bearing the crest of a fictitious Swiss financial institution. She typed in the access codes from the handwritten slip of paper, her fingers moving with deliberate, practiced hesitation. The authentication wheel spun for a few agonizing seconds before the dashboard fully unlocked. Right in the center of the screen, the total available balance loaded in bold black numbers. Exactly $5 million sat in the offshore account. Brent actually grabbed the back of the sofa to steady himself. His chest heaved as he began to hyperventilate. He stared at the 9 digits with a rabid, intoxicating hunger, entirely blinded by the digital illusion my team had meticulously crafted. The crippling terror of his frozen assets and his looming Friday deadline completely vanished from his mind. He was looking at his ultimate salvation. He immediately dropped to his knees beside the sofa, gripping Naomi's arm with bruising force. He commanded her to initiate an immediate wire transfer, his voice rising in an urgent, manic pitch. He spun a rapid, paranoid narrative, insisting that my legal team would realize the breach by morning and lock the offshore funds just like the IRS had locked his personal accounts. He urged her to move the entire $5 million directly into an untraceable, decentralized digital wallet under his exclusive name. He claimed this was the only logical way to completely sever my tyrannical control and protect their future wealth from my interference. He was practically vibrating, begging her to hit the transfer button and secure their escape. Naomi looked down at him, her face a mask of perfectly feigned anxiety, absorbing every ounce of his pathetic desperation, while secretly holding the absolute power in the room. The soft glow of the monitor cast long, sharp shadows across the room, highlighting the sheer greed etched deeply into his features. She stared at the screen, letting the silence stretch to heighten his agonizing suspense. She asked him if he was absolutely sure this was the right move, playing the role of the terrified dependent wife seeking her husband's brilliant guidance. Brent nodded vigorously, his eyes wide and feverish. He promised her that once the money was safely routed into his unmonitored accounts, they would vanish into the European countryside and live like royalty. He framed the theft as a romantic rebellion, a necessary strike against an overbearing father who never believed in their love. He was manipulating her with exactly the same tactics he had used for the past year, completely oblivious to the fact that her emerald eyes were now registering his every lie with surgical precision. Naomi pulled the laptop slightly closer to her chest, breaking his physical grip on her arm. She lowered her gaze, projecting a flawless image of deep hesitation and legal paranoia. She told Brent that a sudden massive transfer of $5 million into a single domestic or personal crypto account would instantly trigger severe federal tax scrutiny. She explained that my accountants were ruthless and would inevitably track the capital flight, unleashing a swarm of auditors to freeze everything they touched. Brent's face paled, the manic high of the money momentarily pierced by the very real threat of further IRS intervention. Before his panic could fully set in, Naomi offered the solution she and I had engineered in my study. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a crisp, professionally bound legal document. She told him that Hayes had previously drafted a post-nuptial independent asset declaration during a prior estate planning session, and she had stolen this copy from his files as well. She explained the logic with cold corporate efficiency. If Brent legally declared total financial independence and explicitly relinquished any and all claims to our marital assets, future alimony, or my domestic estate, the IRS and my corporate auditors could not legally target him as a beneficiary of the stolen funds. It would legally separate his new offshore wealth from my taxable domestic empire. Brent did not hesitate. The prospect of losing the $5 million to another federal freeze terrified him far more than signing away his rights to a domestic estate he believed he was already abandoning. He grabbed a heavy black pen from the coffee table, his hands shaking with eager anticipation. He did not bother to read the complex legal jargon detailing his absolute surrender of all marital rights. He completely ignored the second page of the document, which explicitly stripped him of any legal protection against eviction or asset seizure. He flipped straight to the final signature block and aggressively scrawled his name across the bottom line. He thrust the signed document back into Naomi's hands, panting heavily. He had just voluntarily severed his final legal tie to my family's wealth, eagerly trading his legitimate marital rights for a $5 million mirage. Naomi carefully folded the waiver and secured it in her bag, successfully securing the ultimate legal shield against his inevitable messy downfall. Naomi placed the laptop back onto the coffee table and clicked the transfer authorization button. A sophisticated loading bar appeared on the screen, verifying the routing numbers with a series of complex flashing codes. Then a stark security prompt halted the process. The digital portal displayed a rigid international compliance mandate. It stated that transferring a sum exceeding $1 million from a dormant offshore trust required a mandatory in-person biometric verification at the designated domestic holding firm. Naomi read the prompt aloud, her voice quivering with fake disappointment. The funds could only be released if the primary beneficiary presented themselves physically at Hayes's downtown law office on Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Brent stared at the screen, his jaw clenched tight. The deadline aligned perfectly with the ultimatum given by his underground creditors. Friday was the absolute limit. He forced a stiff, reassuring smile, masking the sheer terror bubbling in his chest. He promised Naomi that going to Hayes's office was a simple procedural hurdle. He assured her he would march in there, bypass the bureaucratic red tape, and secure the wire transfer before noon. He kissed her forehead, completely energized by the promise of his impending payout. Later that night, while Naomi pretended to sleep soundly in the master bedroom, the heavy silence of the apartment complex was broken by Brent's frantic movements. Hayes's private investigator, stationed in an unmarked vehicle across the street, adjusted the zoom on his infrared camera. The high-definition lens captured Brent moving silently through the shadows of their living room. He was dragging a large, hard-shell suitcase toward the front door. The investigator watched as Brent sneaked down to the underground parking garage. He popped the trunk of his Mercedes and hoisted the heavy luggage inside, slamming it shut with a quiet, definitive thud. He was packing his most expensive watches, tailored suits, and the few remaining valuables he possessed. He had absolutely no intention of taking Naomi with him to Europe. He was preparing to walk into Hayes's office, secure the $5 million, and vanish into the wind forever. The investigator transmitted the video feed directly to my secure server. I watched the footage from the dark quiet of my study. The rat was actively building his own cage, completely unaware that Friday morning would not bring his salvation but his total annihilation. Thursday evening descended over the city with a heavy, suffocating drizzle. Brent navigated his Mercedes into the cracked asphalt lot of a dilapidated, neon-lit diner on the industrial outskirts of town. He had chosen this specific location because it was far removed from the upscale establishments where he usually paraded his counterfeit wealth. He slid into a sticky vinyl booth opposite Vanessa. She wore a dark trench coat, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her expression a toxic mixture of lingering rage from the jewelry store, humiliation, and desperate anticipation. Brent did not waste time with apologies. He reached inside his tailored jacket and slid a crisp, printed boarding pass across the table. It was a first-class ticket to Paris, departing tomorrow night. Vanessa stared at the document, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. Brent leaned over the table, his voice a frantic, hushed whisper. He promised her that by sunset tomorrow, they would possess $5 million in untraceable liquid assets. He spun a glorious, manic narrative of their impending escape, detailing how he was going to walk into my lawyer's office, secure the massive offshore wire transfer, and leave his pathetic marriage and crushing debts behind forever. He told her the jewelry store incident was just a minor, temporary glitch in a much larger, brilliant master plan. Vanessa's hostility melted instantly under the heat of his absolute confidence. She smiled a predatory, greedy smirk and slipped the boarding pass into her purse. She leaned across the table and kissed him, completely oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Through the rain-streaked window of the diner, my lead investigator sat in an unmarked sedan, the red recording light of his high-definition camera blinking steadily. He captured the entire exchange perfectly. He zoomed in tight enough to record the flight details on the boarding pass and the specific, eager expressions of two parasites plotting their final escape. Brent was operating with the reckless arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. He was actively burning bridges he had not even crossed yet, spending phantom money and making promises he could never keep. The investigator securely transmitted the photographic evidence to my encrypted drive, sealing the absolute proof of Brent's premeditated flight risk. Brent exited the diner with a triumphant, arrogant strut, entirely energized by Vanessa's renewed affection and his grand illusion of impending wealth. The rain had intensified, washing over the dark parking lot in blinding sheets. He pulled his collar up and jogged toward his luxury vehicle, reaching into his pocket for his keys. He never saw the two massive figures detach themselves from the shadows of the adjacent alleyway. Before Brent could even unlock his car door, a heavy, calloused hand clamped down onto the back of his neck with the force of an industrial vice. He was violently jerked backward and slammed hard against the brick wall of the diner. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. Two towering men dressed in dark, unassuming raincoats pinned him against the wet brick. They were the ruthless enforcement arm of the underground creditors he had been frantically avoiding all week. His Friday deadline had officially expired early. Brent gasped for air, trying to stammer out his rehearsed excuse about the $5 million wire transfer clearing tomorrow morning. The man holding his throat did not let him finish the sentence. He delivered a brutal, calculated punch directly to the center of Brent's face. The sickening crunch of breaking cartilage echoed through the alley. Brent screamed, blood pouring instantly from his shattered nose, painting his expensive white shirt a bright, horrific crimson. He slumped forward, but the second man drove a heavy combat boot straight into Brent's side. The sharp snap of a cracking rib forced a desperate wet choke from his throat. He dropped to his knees, clutching his ribs, spitting blood and rainwater onto the pavement. The first man leaned down, grabbing a fistful of Brent's hair to force his gaze upward. The enforcer spoke in a low, terrifyingly calm voice. He stated that patience was a luxury their employers no longer possessed. He informed Brent that the massive cryptocurrency debt was now due in full. He gave him exactly 24 hours to deliver the cash, or the next visit would not end with a simple beating. They dropped him onto the wet asphalt and disappeared back into the shadows as quickly as they had emerged. Brent lay shivering in the cold rain, coughing up blood, entirely paralyzed by the sheer violence of his reality. Brent managed to crawl into his car and drive back to the luxury apartment, gripping the steering wheel with trembling, blood-stained hands. He stumbled through the front door, leaving a trail of muddy crimson footprints across the pristine hardwood floors. He clutched his broken ribs, gasping in pure physical agony, and collapsed onto the living room sofa. Naomi emerged from the master bedroom, tying her silk robe. She stopped and stared at the bruised, bloody, and defeated man shivering on her expensive furniture. Brent immediately launched into a frantic, pathetic lie, claiming he had been unexpectedly mugged by two armed men outside a local convenience store. He sobbed, begging for sympathy, portraying himself as the completely innocent victim of a random, brutal street crime. Naomi did not rush to his side. She did not cry out in panic or immediately dial for emergency medical services. She walked into the adjacent bathroom and returned with a warm, damp towel and a fully stocked first aid kit. She sat beside him on the sofa and began to wipe the drying blood from his shattered nose with an icy, mechanical precision. Her emerald eyes were entirely devoid of any natural human empathy. She was operating with the cold, detached efficiency of a mortician preparing a body for display. She listened to his whimpering, fabricated excuses, applying sterile bandages to his cuts without uttering a single word of comfort. She knew exactly who had beaten him in the dark, and she knew exactly why it had happened. When he finally stopped crying, she placed her hand gently over his trembling fingers. She told him he absolutely needed to push through the temporary physical pain. She specifically reminded him that tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock he had to walk into Hayes's downtown law office to properly authenticate the $5 million offshore transfer. She framed the massive theft as their only remaining salvation, urging him to rest and gather his strength for their final, ultimate victory. Brent swallowed the manipulation completely. He nodded weakly, leaning into her cold touch, genuinely believing her lack of emotional hysterics was simply quiet, supportive strength. He dragged his battered body into the master bedroom and collapsed onto the mattress, groaning in pain. He closed his bruised eyes, clinging desperately to the illusion of the offshore wealth waiting for him in the morning. He drifted into a restless sleep, completely and entirely unaware that his execution date had already been permanently set. Friday morning dawned with a harsh, glaring sunlight that cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hayes's downtown corporate law office. I sat silently in a high-backed leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany conference table. Naomi sat directly to my right. Her posture was impeccable, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face an unreadable mask of absolute chilling calm. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass door swung open. Brent walked into the room. He was attempting to project the triumphant, untouchable swagger of a man who had successfully outsmarted everyone, but his physical reality betrayed his arrogant facade. He moved with a rigid, unnatural stiffness, clearly favoring the cracked rib he had suffered in the dark alleyway less than 12 hours prior. A pair of oversized, dark designer sunglasses covered the upper half of his face, a pathetic and obvious attempt to hide his severely bruised broken nose and the surrounding swollen tissue. He wore a sharp, freshly pressed tailored suit, trying desperately to reclaim his polished executive persona. He flashed a tight, painful smile as he approached the table. He greeted Naomi with a forced tone of affectionate relief, acting the part of the devoted husband who had survived a random mugging, then offered a stiff, victorious nod in my direction. He took the plush leather chair opposite us, wincing slightly as he lowered his battered body into the seat. He was completely blinded by his own intoxicating greed and absolute hubris. He genuinely believed that the post-nuptial independent asset declaration he had hastily signed the night before was his golden ticket legally shielding the $5 million he was preparing to steal. He looked at me convinced I was a defeated, desperate father who had been backed into a corner, forced to quietly bypass federal auditors to save my daughter's future. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cool glass surface of the table, and arrogantly asked Hayes to finalize the authentication protocols so he could get the offshore wire transfer moving immediately. He checked his luxury platinum watch, maintaining his fabricated sense of urgent corporate timing, entirely unaware that the countdown was actually for his own demise. Hayes stood at the far end of the room, his expression completely devoid of any human emotion. He smoothed his silk tie and stepped forward with predatory precision, placing a thick black leather binder directly in front of Brent's seat. Hayes opened the binder, revealing a stack of dense, officially stamped financial documents bearing fake institutional seals. Brent did not even bother to scan the dense legal text. His breathing hitched with shallow, eager anticipation, his chest rising and falling rapidly despite his cracked rib. He immediately reached across the table, his fingers stretching hungrily toward the heavy silver fountain pen resting near the documents. He was mere seconds away from attempting to authorize the phantom $5 million wire transfer that would supposedly solve all his violent looming problems. I raised my right hand, a single definitive gesture that commanded the silent room. I instructed Brent to put the pen down. He paused, his hand hovering over the silver barrel, a flash of genuine irritation breaking through his manufactured confidence. He asked if there was a problem with the offshore routing numbers, his voice tightening with a sudden edge of panic. I did not answer his question. Instead, I picked up a small black remote control resting beside my coffee mug. I pressed the primary button. The automated blackout blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows instantly descended, plunging the bright, sunlit conference room into a heavy, dramatic twilight. A large projector screen smoothly lowered from the ceiling panels directly behind my chair. The high-definition projector hummed to life. The screen did not illuminate with Swiss banking portals or offshore transaction codes. It blazed with crystal-clear, time-stamped surveillance footage captured less than 12 hours ago. The high-resolution video displayed the grimy interior of the roadside diner. Brent was clearly visible, sliding a crisp, printed boarding pass across a sticky laminate table into Vanessa's waiting hands. The audio was muted, but the visual evidence was absolute and devastating. The camera zoomed in with surgical precision, capturing the airline logo, the first-class designation, and the Paris destination printed clearly on the ticket. The footage then captured Vanessa leaning across the table to passionately kiss him, their faces illuminated by the neon diner sign. I let the video loop continuously, forcing him to watch his own premeditated betrayal projected in massive, undeniable scale. Brent froze completely. The color drained from his face so rapidly his bruised, swollen nose stood out like a grotesque purple stain against his pale, sweating skin. The heavy silver fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the mahogany table and rolling onto the plush carpet. His breathing became completely erratic, his chest heaving violently as the crushing reality of the trap finally closed around his throat. He stared at the giant projector screen, his mouth opening and closing silently as he frantically scrambled to formulate a plausible lie. He looked wildly at me, then turned his desperate, panic-stricken gaze toward Naomi. He stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward, attempting to claim the footage was somehow fabricated or taken wildly out of context. He tried to tell her that Vanessa was just a distressed former colleague he was helping to relocate out of sheer charity. The pathetic excuses died in his throat. He saw the cold, dead certainty burning in Naomi's emerald eyes. She did not display a single ounce of the submissive, panicked wife she had played the night before. She sat with the absolute authority of a woman who had orchestrated his complete and total destruction. Slowly, deliberately, Naomi raised her left hand. She grasped the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring he had used to secure his initial entry into our family wealth. She pulled the heavy platinum band off her finger. She did not throw it in anger or weep over the lost marriage. She casually flicked her wrist with total disdain. The diamond slid across the smooth glass center of the conference table. It emitted a sharp, continuous scratching sound before coming to a complete stop exactly 1 inch from Brent's trembling, blood-stained hands. She looked at him with profound, icy disgust. She calmly informed him that his pathetic performance was officially over. She stated with absolute, crushing clarity that there was no $5 million offshore account, there was no international wire transfer, and he had completely surrendered every single legal claim to her assets the exact moment he signed the post-nuptial waiver. The heavy silence of the glass room swallowed his desperate, suffocating gasps for air. He was utterly ruined, trapped in a high-rise cage facing a mountain of insurmountable debt, violent underground creditors, and absolute zero. The sharp scratch of the diamond ring sliding across the glass table severed the last thread of Brent's sanity. He stared at the glittering stone resting millimeters from his fingertips, his breath hitching in a ragged, panicked rhythm. The carefully constructed corporate facade he had maintained for months instantly disintegrated. He looked at Naomi, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for any trace of the submissive, desperate woman he had manipulated just hours ago. He found nothing but cold, impenetrable resolve. He realized with absolute crushing certainty that she had known everything. She had played him perfectly. The offshore account, the secret access codes, the entire story of her rebellion against me was a perfectly executed, synchronized trap. The humiliation and total loss of control triggered a violent, manic reaction. His chest heaved as he pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice tearing through the quiet room in a shrill, hysterical scream. He shouted that I had poisoned his marriage from the very beginning. He accused me of weaponizing my wealth to turn his own wife against him, completely ignoring his own vile betrayals and predatory greed. He yelled that I was a tyrannical, manipulative old man who could not stand to see anyone else succeed. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin. His desperation morphed into blind, irrational violence. He planted his hands on the mahogany table and vaulted forward, lunging directly toward me with his hands outstretched like claws. He never even came close. Before his feet could leave the plush carpet, the heavy oak doors at the back of the conference room burst open. 2 massive suited security guardsmen who had been waiting silently in the adjacent corridor for exactly this moment moved with terrifying speed. The first guard grabbed Brent by the back of his tailored collar, halting his momentum instantly. The second guard seized his arm, twisting it upward at a sharp, agonizing angle. Brent let out a strangled yelp as his feet were swept out from under him. They slammed him face down against the thick glass surface of the conference table. The impact rattled the heavy mahogany frame, his cheek pressed hard against the cold glass exactly beside the discarded engagement ring. He thrashed and kicked wildly, screaming obscenities, but the guards applied calculated, paralyzing pressure to his joints, pinning him completely motionless under the harsh fluorescent lights. I did not flinch when his body struck the glass. I calmly unbuttoned my suit jacket and pushed my leather chair back from the head of the table. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room returning despite Brent's heavy, panicked breathing. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table, my footsteps completely silent on the carpet. I stopped right beside him. He was pinned awkwardly, his face mashed against the glass, his bruised and swollen nose practically flattened by the guard's unyielding pressure. I placed my hands on the table and leaned down, bringing my face level with his. I looked into his frantic, darting eyes, watching the raw terror strip away any remaining trace of his arrogance. I moved closer, stopping mere inches from his bruised ear. I kept my voice incredibly low, letting the absolute chilling calmness of my tone cut through his panicked state. I told him I would rather chew glass than let him touch my daughter. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Brent's eyes widened to an impossible degree. His thrashing ceased instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The phrase hit him with the force of a physical blow. He recognized those exact words. It was the precise, arrogant insult he had spat to Vanessa on the very first night I had ever met him, standing on the country club balcony, thinking he was completely unobserved. I watched the horrific realization detonate behind his eyes. He finally understood the true magnitude of his destruction. He realized I had heard him on day one. I had known his true parasitic nature from the absolute beginning. Every single interaction we had ever shared, every business dinner, every financial discussion, every seemingly generous investment advice had been a meticulously calculated snare. I had patiently constructed a sprawling invisible labyrinth over the course of an entire year, allowing him to confidently walk himself directly into the center of his own execution. The engagement, the marriage, the sudden financial crises, and the fake $5 million bait were all perfectly engineered mechanisms designed to extract him from my daughter's life while simultaneously destroying his own. He was not a victim of bad luck or market fluctuations. He was the target of a perfectly executed year-long demolition. I stood up and gave a brief, subtle nod to Hayes. The corporate lawyer adjusted his silver glasses and instructed the two security guards to release their hold. They hauled Brent upward by his armpits, dragging him backward and dropping him forcefully into the leather chair. He slumped forward, gasping for air, clutching his injured ribs with trembling hands. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He looked entirely broken, a pathetic shadow of the polished executive who had strutted into the room just minutes prior. Hayes stepped forward, completely ignoring Brent's pathetic whimpering. He closed the thick leather binder containing the fake offshore routing numbers and smoothly slid it off the table. In its place, he pushed forward a new, significantly thicker stack of manila folders. He dropped them directly in front of Brent with a heavy, definitive thud. I told Brent to look at the paperwork. I informed him that there was no $5 million trust fund waiting to solve his problems. The documents in front of him were the real, inescapable mechanics of his permanent downfall. Brent slowly raised his head, his hands shaking violently as he opened the first folder. It was a comprehensive, legally certified dossier outlining his extensive wire fraud. The pages detailed every single illegal transaction he had routed through his shell companies, complete with IP addresses, timestamps, and routing numbers. The second folder contained a forensic accounting report of his proprietary tech startup, providing absolute proof of his massive ongoing embezzlement from his own investors. He had effectively stolen millions from his own board of directors to finance his fraudulent lifestyle. Then Hayes slid the final document across the glass. It was a highly detailed, meticulously accurate ledger of the illegal cryptocurrency debt he owed to the underground syndicate. It listed the exact sums, the accrued interest, and the names of the violent men who had beaten him in the alleyway just hours ago. I leaned forward and told him that this entire dossier had already been transmitted to the federal authorities, his corporate board, and the local police department. His assets were permanently frozen, his career was obliterated, and his violent creditors were actively hunting him. He was completely out of time, out of money, and completely out of options. Hayes picked up his heavy silver fountain pen and tapped it twice against the thick glass of the conference table. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of Brent's manufactured life. Hayes adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began to speak with the absolute lethal precision of a corporate executioner. He pointed a steady finger directly at the post-nuptial independent asset declaration that Brent had so eagerly signed the night before. Hayes explicitly reminded him of the legal mechanisms buried deep within that specific document. He explained that Brent had been entirely blinded by the digital illusion of a $5 million offshore account, completely failing to read the comprehensive waivers meticulously engineered into the second page of the contract. Hayes spelled out the brutal, undeniable reality of his signature. By legally separating his assets to allegedly avoid federal tax scrutiny, Brent had unconditionally forfeited every single right to any marital property. The legally binding contract permanently stripped him of all community protections, spousal support, and severance capital. Hayes stated with absolute clarity that Naomi retained full, uncontested ownership of the luxury apartment, both of the premium vehicles in the garage, and every single cent inside their joint and personal banking accounts. Brent's breathing turned shallow and rapid as the walls of his financial prison closed in tight. Hayes continued his relentless dismantling of Brent's life. He informed the broken man that the designer suits, expensive watches, and electronic devices sitting in the luggage currently hidden in the trunk of his Mercedes were legally classified as marital assets purchased with Naomi's family trust. Therefore, those items were now the exclusive protected property of my daughter. Brent gripped the arms of the leather chair, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to process the sheer totality of his loss. He possessed absolutely nothing. He had no leverage, no hidden capital, and no legal standing to contest the arrangement in any court. He had actively, voluntarily signed his own financial death warrant out of pure, unadulterated greed. Hayes folded his hands over the document and looked at Brent with profound professional disgust. He stated that the legal transfer of assets was already completed, filed and officially stamped by a private judge hours before Brent even walked into the building. The financial execution was permanent binding and completely irreversible. I stepped forward, positioning myself right in Brent's direct line of sight to ensure he could not look away from the architect of his destruction. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a single, neatly folded legal document. I dropped it onto the glass table directly over his terrifying ledger of underground debts and slid it smoothly toward his trembling hands. I told him he was looking at an expedited, uncontested, fault-based divorce decree. I laid out his final two options with brutal, uncompromising clarity. Option 1 required him to pick up the silver pen sign his name on the dotted line and legally dissolve the fraudulent marriage immediately without a single condition. If he chose this path, I would graciously allow him to stand up from the leather chair, walk out of the glass-walled conference room, and step onto the busy city sidewalk with absolutely nothing but the bruised, bloody clothes currently on his back. I promised him a short head start to run from the underground enforcers who were actively hunting him for the missing cryptocurrency funds. Option 2 was a refusal. I informed him that if he hesitated, argued, or attempted to negotiate for a single dollar of my family's money, my security team would immediately drag him out of the room by his broken ribs. I explained that I had 3 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division waiting in an unmarked black vehicle directly in the subterranean parking garage below us. If he chose option 2, I would personally walk downstairs and hand them the entire unredacted dossier containing the absolute proof of his wire fraud, his massive corporate embezzlement, and his illegal offshore crypto laundering. He would be arrested in the lobby, federally indicted before lunch, and spend the next 20 years rotting in a maximum security penitentiary, while his violent creditors waited patiently for his eventual release. Brent stared at the divorce decree, his chest heaving as a cold sweat beaded on his forehead. The illusion of his leverage was entirely shattered. He realized I was not offering a negotiation. I was offering a dictated, unconditional surrender. He was completely trapped between the federal government and a violent underground syndicate. He grabbed the silver fountain pen, his hand shaking so violently he could barely manage his signature. He pressed the nib against the thick paper and signed away the marriage he had spent a year manipulating, desperate to avoid federal prison. Brent dropped the pen, leaving a dark ink stain on the pristine glass table. He pushed himself backward, staggering slightly as his cracked rib flared with fresh, blinding agony. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly around the immaculate room as his panicked brain desperately searched for a final hidden exit strategy. He shoved a trembling hand into his torn jacket pocket and pulled out his mobile phone, frantically swiping at the cracked screen with a blood-stained thumb. I knew exactly who he was trying to contact. He was attempting to activate his ultimate desperate backup plan, hoping to reach Vanessa and orchestrate an immediate escape to the international airport using the hidden emergency cash he had stashed away months ago. I did not instruct the security guards to stop him. I stood completely still, arms folded across my chest, and allowed him to dial the number. The call went straight to an automated, disconnected voicemail system. Brent pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the dark screen in pure, unadulterated disbelief. I broke the silence of the conference room, my voice dripping with cold, calculated satisfaction. I informed him that dialing her number was a massive, pathetic waste of his rapidly expiring time. I told him that at exactly 6 o'clock this morning, Hayes's aggressive legal team had intercepted Vanessa. We had sent a private courier directly to her luxury apartment complex, hand-delivering a sealed envelope containing the high-resolution photographs of his massive underground debt ledger and the federal fraud indictments currently looming over his head. I watched Brent's jaw drop in horror as I explained the fundamental reality of his mistress. I told him that a woman driven entirely by parasitic greed possesses absolutely zero loyalty to a sinking, doomed ship. Once Vanessa realized he was not a brilliant millionaire, but a heavily indebted, hunted fraudster facing a lifetime in federal prison, her self-preservation instinct immediately took over. She completely canceled his companion ticket to Paris. She located the hidden emergency cash he had foolishly stashed inside her apartment safe and packed her bags with ruthless, selfish efficiency. I confirmed that she had boarded the early morning international flight to France entirely alone, taking every last cent of his remaining capital with her. Brent stood frozen in the center of the room, the phone slipping from his loose grip and clattering loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. The absolute magnitude of his isolation finally settled over him like a suffocating shroud. He had lost my daughter, his stolen wealth, his corporate startup, and his mistress in a single devastating morning. He was utterly, completely alone with nowhere left to run. Brent stared at the empty space where his grand illusions had just evaporated. The suffocating silence of the glass room pressed against him heavy and absolute. The reality of his complete isolation finally shattered the last fragile remnants of his polished corporate disguise. His expensive tailoring and styled hair were nothing but a cheap costume that was now burning away, exposing the rot underneath. A low, guttural sound clawed its way up his throat, vibrating with a venomous hatred that he could no longer contain. He turned his bloodshot, bruised eyes toward me, and the sophisticated finance executive vanished entirely. In his place stood a cornered, feral beast. He launched into a vile, unhinged tirade, his voice cracking as he spewed a barrage of deeply ingrained, repulsive bigotry. He cursed our background with absolute malice, spitting out racist insults that he had clearly harbored since the very first day he shook my hand. He screamed that we were nothing but uncultured, new money trash, claiming that our heritage made us inherently inferior to his own fabricated pedigree. He shouted that no amount of wealth could ever wash away where we came from, his words dripping with a toxic, desperate superiority complex. He raged against the fact that he, a man who believed himself genetically destined for greatness, had been outsmarted by people he fundamentally despised. Every vicious slur he hurled echoed against the mahogany walls, proving irrevocably that his charming, inclusive persona had always been a calculated, hollow lie. He aimed his vitriol directly at Naomi, expecting to see her crumble under the weight of his verbal assault. He wanted to inflict one final, deeply personal wound before he fell. He screamed that she was a pathetic joke, a miserable woman trying to buy a class she could never naturally possess. He braced himself, waiting for her tears, waiting for her to break. Naomi did not move a single muscle. She sat perfectly still in her high-backed leather chair, her posture impeccably straight. Her emerald eyes tracked his erratic, violent movements with chilling detachment. She did not display a shred of sorrow or anger. She simply watched him rant and rave, her expression identical to a clinical scientist observing a particularly disgusting, predictable insect trapped inside a glass jar. His hatred was completely impotent against her armor of absolute indifference. I remained entirely impassive as his bigoted venom filled the room. In my early days building my logistics company, I had faced down genuinely dangerous, powerful men who tried to intimidate me with weapons and organized violence. A ruined, bleeding fraudster throwing a racist tantrum in a boardroom was a profoundly pathetic spectacle. I did not raise my voice to defend my heritage, nor did I offer him the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. His words were entirely meaningless to me, but they possessed a highly specific tactical value. I reached into my jacket pocket with slow, deliberate movements. I retrieved my mobile phone, tapped the screen twice, and placed it face up squarely in the center of the glass table. The bright red recording icon pulsed steadily, capturing every single vile, hateful syllable he had just screamed. Brent's voice abruptly caught in his throat. His manic tirade choked off into a sudden, horrifying silence as his bloodshot eyes locked onto the recording device. He realized instantly what he had just done. I leaned across the table, maintaining a dangerously low, even tone. I informed him that his spontaneous outburst was the final nail in his professional coffin. I explained that this high-definition audio file would not remain private. I promised him that by the time the sun set, this exact recording would be securely transmitted to every corporate compliance officer, human resources director, and hiring manager within a 500-mile radius. I detailed how his voice, spewing undeniable aggressive bigotry, would be permanently attached to his digital footprint. Even if he somehow managed to evade federal prison, he would never set foot inside a white-collar office again. He would never secure another executive position, never convince another board of directors to trust him, and never wear another tailored suit in a corporate environment. The sophisticated financial world he desperately craved would violently reject him. His reputation was now completely and irrevocably incinerated. I told him he had just permanently exiled himself to the lowest, darkest rungs of society. Brent stared at the pulsing red light on the screen, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was completely paralyzed. The trap was absolutely flawless, anticipating his every predictable flaw, including his deep-seated arrogant prejudice. He finally understood that I had accounted for his true nature long before he even realized it himself. The heavy, suffocating weight of total defeat finally crushed the fight out of him. His shoulders slumped forward and his head bowed as the last ounce of his manufactured pride evaporated into the cold air of the conference room. He was entirely cornered, stripped of his wealth, his marriage, his mistress, and his future. The federal agents waiting in the subterranean parking garage were a very real, immediate threat, and the violent underground creditors hunting him were an inescapable reality. He possessed absolutely no leverage and no remaining avenues for escape. He looked down at the fault-based divorce decree resting on the glass table directly over his ledger of illegal debts. His hands shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor driven by a mixture of profound terror and impotent boiling rage. He reached out and grabbed the heavy silver fountain pen, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the metal barrel. He did not read the terms of his surrender. He dragged the document toward him, positioning the nib over the final signature line. He pressed down with reckless, aggressive force, transferring every ounce of his remaining anger into the physical act of signing. He scrawled his name so violently that the sharp metal tip sliced directly through the thick, expensive parchment, leaving a jagged tear across the paper. The sheer physical exertion of his anger caused his battered body to rebel. A fresh wave of agony shot through his cracked rib, forcing him to sharply inhale. As he gritted his teeth against the pain, a single heavy drop of dark crimson blood fell from his severely bruised, broken nose. It landed directly on the torn signature line, blooming outward and staining the white paper. It was a literal, undeniable blood contract, permanently sealing his total surrender. Brent stared at the dark red stain for a fraction of a second, the visual confirmation of his physical and financial ruin. He let out a ragged, animalistic growl of pure frustration. He ripped his hand away from the document and hurled the heavy silver pen across the room. It struck the mahogany wall with a sharp crack, falling harmlessly to the floor. He sat back in the leather chair, clutching his bleeding face entirely broken. The execution was complete. The silent adjustment was finalized. We had reclaimed our empire, and he was nothing but a ghost. The sharp crack of the silver pen hitting the mahogany wall served as the final punctuation mark to Brent's total surrender. Hayes stepped forward with mechanical efficiency, grasped the edge of the fault-based divorce decree, and carefully slid it away from Brent's trembling hands. The dark crimson blood from Brent's shattered nose had already begun to dry into the paper, permanently binding his signature to his own financial ruin. Hayes slipped the document into a pristine manila folder and snapped it shut. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the conference room swung open. Brent jerked his head upward, his bloodshot eyes wide with manic desperation, expecting to see the underground enforcers arriving to collect their pound of flesh. Instead, two men in identical, sharply tailored dark gray suits stepped into the room. They moved with the unmistakable synchronized authority of federal law enforcement. Gold badges gleamed on their belts as they bypassed the private security guards and walked directly toward the glass table. Brent let out a hollow, suffocating gasp. He turned his terrified gaze toward me, his voice a frantic whisper demanding to know why the federal authorities were here when he had just signed my unconditional agreement. I looked down at him with absolute glacial detachment. I informed him that I had never possessed any intention of letting him walk out of this building. I explained that Hayes and his team of forensic accountants had formally submitted the entire unredacted dossier of his corporate embezzlement, his wire fraud, and his illegal cryptocurrency laundering to the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 3 weeks ago. The extensive federal investigation was already complete, and the grand jury had issued a sealed indictment 48 hours prior. The choice I had generously offered him mere minutes ago was a complete and total fabrication. It was a calculated psychological manipulation designed solely to force his signature on the divorce decree, completely bypassing years of tedious contested litigation in family court. I needed him backed into an absolute corner, blinded by the terrifying illusion of a ticking clock, so he would willingly surrender every legal claim to my daughter's assets without a single argument. Brent's bruised jaw trembled as the sheer devastating scale of the deception crushed his final remaining hope. He realized that the brief head start I had promised him was nothing but a phantom lifeline dangled in front of a drowning man just to extract his unconditional surrender before the authorities tightened the noose. The taller of the two federal agents stepped up to the back of Brent's leather chair. The agent stated Brent's full legal name, his voice echoing with cold bureaucratic finality. He announced that Brent was officially under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. As the agent began reading the Miranda rights in a steady, unyielding monotone, the last remaining fragments of Brent's arrogant executive persona completely evaporated. The cornered beast transformed instantly into a sniveling, pathetic coward. He slumped forward in his chair, his shoulders shaking violently as a wet, ragged sob tore through his throat. He realized his life as a wealthy, respected finance bro was permanently over-replaced by the grim reality of a federal penitentiary. In a final desperate act of preservation, he turned his bruised and bloodied face toward Naomi. He threw himself forward, falling hard onto his knees against the plush carpet, ignoring the sharp agony of his cracked rib. He reached out with trembling, desperate hands begging her to stop them. He sobbed uncontrollably, tears mixing with the drying blood on his face, claiming that they were still a family. He pleaded with her to remember their vows, begging her to call off the agent, swearing that he would change, that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to her. He weaponized the word family, attempting to exploit the very empathy he had spent the last year mocking and manipulating. Naomi did not flinch. She did not recoil from his bloody hands, nor did she display a single ounce of pity. She looked down at the broken, weeping man kneeling on the floor with a gaze of absolute zero emotion. She possessed the chilling, untouchable calm of a woman who had successfully excised a tumor from her life. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into a quiet, razor-sharp whisper that sliced right through his hysterical sobbing. She informed him that family does not secretly refer to their wives as desperate cows to their mistresses. The words struck Brent with lethal precision. His sobbing choked off, instantly replaced by a suffocating, horrified silence. He realized she had heard the secret audio recordings. She knew every vile, mocking insult he had whispered in dark hotel rooms. His final attempt at manipulation collapsed into dust. The federal agent stepped forward, grabbing Brent roughly by the shoulders and hauling him to his feet. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the glass room, sealing his fate. The two federal agents flanked Brent, securing a tight, unrelenting grip on his biceps. They turned him toward the heavy oak doors and marched him forward. The private security guards stepped aside, allowing the procession to exit the conference room. Brent stumbled over his own feet, his head hanging low, his blood-stained shirt and torn jacket putting his absolute ruin on full display. As they crossed the threshold, the full weight of his public humiliation commenced. The expansive open-plan bullpen of Hayes's corporate law firm was completely silent. Dozens of high-powered attorneys, senior paralegals, and administrative staff members stood frozen at their desks. Every single eye in the massive room was locked directly onto Brent. There were no whispers, no gasps of surprise, only the heavy, judgmental silence of an elite professional class watching an arrogant fraudster get paraded through their territory like a common street criminal. Brent squeezed his eyes shut, unable to bear the searing weight of their collective disgust. He had spent his entire career desperately trying to impress people exactly like the ones currently watching his perp walk, and now they were witnessing his permanent expulsion from their world. The agents marched him relentlessly toward the main elevators, the sound of his scuffing shoes fading down the long marble corridor. I did not follow them out. I turned away from the glass table and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I picked up the black remote control and pressed the secondary button. The automated blackout blinds smoothly retracted, flooding the conference room with harsh, blinding morning sunlight. I stood with my hands clasped behind my back, looking down at the bustling city streets several stories below. After a few silent minutes, the heavy glass doors of the building's subterranean parking garage swung open. Two unmarked black federal vehicles surged onto the pavement, their red and blue emergency lights flashing silently in the bright daylight. I watched the vehicles merge aggressively into the dense downtown traffic, carrying Brent away from our lives forever. He would spend the next 2 decades locked in a federal cage, entirely consumed by the violent debt he could never repay. The threat was completely neutralized. The invisible labyrinth had functioned flawlessly. I heard a soft rustle of fabric behind me. Naomi stood up from her leather chair. The rigid, flawless posture she had maintained throughout the entire execution finally softened. Her shoulders dropped, and the profound, crushing tension she had carried for a year left her body in a single wave. She looked out the window beside me and let out a long, heavy exhale of total, undeniable liberation. Our silent adjustment was complete and our family was finally secure. The heavy guttural roar of a diesel engine shattered the quiet tranquility of the Friday morning. A massive flatbed tow truck sat idling in the center of my circular driveway. Heavy steel chains securely fastened to the axles of Brent's custom matte black sports car. It had been exactly 7 days since the federal agents escorted Brent out of the glass-walled conference room in handcuffs. The government had moved with terrifying, relentless speed, freezing his phantom accounts and issuing seizure warrants for any tangible asset tied to his name to cover the massive federal restitution. A team of court-appointed repossession agents swarmed the property, systematically stripping away the physical inventory of his fabricated life. They carried out his expensive tailored suits, his imported leather briefcases, and the ridiculous collection of luxury watches he had purchased using his embezzled startup funds. The agents tossed the high-end items unceremoniously into the back of a sterile moving van like cheap garage sale discards. Naomi stood beside me on the manicured lawn, a steaming mug of dark coffee in her hands. The crisp morning breeze caught her hair as she watched the workers dismantle the remaining physical remnants of her fraudulent marriage. She did not shed a single tear for the towed vehicle or the boxed-up designer clothes. She observed the chaotic, noisy process with the detached, peaceful serenity of a homeowner watching a pest control crew finally eliminate a severe infestation. The toxic element was being permanently removed from her environment. Brent had spent an entire year meticulously curating an image of untouchable financial dominance, building his entire identity around those flashy, expensive objects to hide his parasitic reality. Now the state was liquidating his entire fake persona piece by piece to pay for his very real crimes. The heavy tow truck engaged its gears, dragging the sports car down the street and out of sight. The moving van followed closely behind, carrying the last fragments of his existence to a government auction lot. Naomi took a slow sip of her coffee and turned to me with a genuine, unburdened smile. The suffocating weight of the past 12 months had completely vanished from her shoulders. The moving van had barely disappeared around the corner when a sleek, silver luxury sedan turned sharply into the driveway. The tires crunched aggressively against the gravel, braking far too close to the front steps. The doors slammed shut with heavy metallic thuds. Brent's parents, Richard and Eleanor, marched up the front walkway with furious, entitled strides. They bypassed all basic social etiquette, their faces flushed with righteous indignation. Richard pointed a shaking finger at me the second I opened the heavy oak door, accusing me of malicious entrapment. He threatened me with a massive, ruinous civil lawsuit, screaming that I had orchestrated a vast, illegal conspiracy to frame his brilliant, innocent son. Eleanor glared at Naomi with pure venom, claiming we were entirely intimidated by Brent's superior intellect and cultured background, forcing him into a corner out of sheer vindictive jealousy. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical shouting. I stepped back and cordially invited them inside, leading them into the formal sitting room. I instructed the housekeeper to bring a fresh pot of Earl Grey tea and took a seat in my armchair. I allowed them to exhaust their breath, listening patiently as Richard rattled off a litany of empty legal threats and fabricated accusations. Once his voice finally cracked from the exertion, I reached into my jacket pocket. I placed my mobile phone face up on the antique coffee table and pressed play. The pristine acoustics of the formal sitting room amplified Brent's hysterical, bigoted voice perfectly. The high-definition recording from the glass conference room filled the air. Brent's voice screamed the vile, racist slurs with unmistakable malice. He cursed our background, proving irrevocably that his cultured, inclusive finance bro persona had always been a calculated mask for deep-seated, repulsive bigotry. He bragged about his manipulation, his words dripping with a toxic superiority complex. The blood completely drained from Richard's face. Eleanor's mouth opened in silent, paralyzing horror. The undeniable sound of their son aggressively exposing his true monstrous nature instantly shattered their arrogant narrative. They sat frozen on the edge of the sofa, entirely incapable of defending the horrific bigotry echoing through the room. The recording clicked off, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in its wake. The freshly poured tea sat untouched, cooling rapidly in porcelain cups. Before Richard could formulate a pathetic excuse or attempt to claim the audio was somehow doctored, I reached down and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out the thick, meticulously detailed ledger of Brent's illegal cryptocurrency debts. I dropped the heavy stack of papers directly onto the coffee table with a resounding thud. I informed them that this document contained the full, uncompromising accounting of the millions their son had stolen from a violent underground syndicate. I explained that the men actively hunting Brent did not care about federal indictments, white-collar prisons, or court dates. They only cared about recovering their missing cash, and they possessed the brutal means to extract it from him behind bars. I slid the ledger across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of Richard's trembling hands. I offered him a very simple, straightforward proposition. I told him that if they truly believed in their son's inherent goodness, if they were fiercely dedicated to protecting their family bloodline against my supposed conspiracies, they could formally assume his debt right now. I invited them to liquidate their own pristine estate, drain their retirement accounts, and pay off the mobsters to save their son from being violently targeted in federal prison. Richard stared at the multi-million-dollar figure printed boldly at the bottom of the ledger. His hands shook violently. The fierce protective parental outrage that had fueled his entrance evaporated entirely, replaced by raw, selfish terror. Eleanor shrank back into the cushions, her eyes wide with fear. They realized the terrifying reality of the man they had raised. Brent was not an innocent victim. He was a massive, highly dangerous liability that threatened to drag them down into his self-made abyss. Richard slowly pushed the ledger back across the table, refusing to touch it for a second longer. He stood up on shaking legs and grabbed his wife by the arm. They did not utter a single word of apology or offer another hollow legal threat. They turned their backs on their son's debt and walked out the front door in absolute cowardly silence. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, permanently severing the final tie to that toxic bloodline. The sharp scent of exposed brick and freshly cut timber replaced the sterile, suffocating air of the luxury high-rise. Exactly 3 months had passed since the final echoes of Brent's toxic bloodline faded from our driveway. Naomi stood in the center of a cavernous, dilapidated warehouse in the historic industrial district. Sunlight poured through the massive, grime-streaked skylights, illuminating the thick layers of dust dancing in the air. She wore worn denim work pants and a simple cotton shirt, her hair tied back carelessly, a stark contrast to the heavily curated, suffocating wardrobe Brent had forced upon her. She swung a heavy steel sledgehammer against a decaying plaster partition wall, the intense physical exertion acting as a violent, necessary exorcism of her past. I stood near the heavy iron doors, holding a thermos of dark coffee, watching her reclaim her identity brick by brick. I had offered to finance the entire renovation project outright. I had presented her with the necessary capital from the family trust to bypass the agonizing bureaucracy of commercial lending and launch her independent architecture firm immediately. She had firmly, unequivocally rejected the offer. She looked at me across the dusty floor and stated with absolute clarity that Brent's greatest weapon had been financial manipulation, and she would never allow her professional foundation to be built on an easy, inherited safety net. She insisted on applying for a commercial bank loan entirely on her own merit. She spent weeks meticulously compiling a massive, undeniably brilliant portfolio of her previous architectural designs, structural analyses, and urban planning models. She walked into the downtown commercial lending office armed only with her raw talent and an airtight, aggressively researched business plan. She did not leverage our family name, nor did she mention the sprawling logistics empire I had built. She sat across from a panel of skeptical loan officers and dismantled their financial hesitations with the exact same lethal precision she had used to dismantle her fraudulent marriage. She fought for every single dollar of that startup capital, presenting thick-bound folders detailing structural load capacities and sustainable development frameworks. The loan officers scrutinized her projections, challenged her timelines, and ultimately surrendered to her undeniable expertise. The commercial loan was approved in record time, and the physical transformation of the historic warehouse was nothing short of miraculous. The grand opening of Naomi's independent architecture firm took place on a crisp Friday evening, exactly 6 months after Brent had been hauled away in federal chains. The cavernous space was now a breathtaking testament to her structural brilliance, featuring exposed steel beams, warm industrial lighting, and expansive drafting tables showcasing her innovative blueprints. The opening night reception was not a hollow plastic networking event populated by the parasitic gold diggers and superficial social climbers Brent had relentlessly courted. The room was filled with genuine industry professionals, established contractors with calloused hands, structural engineers, and serious urban developers who evaluated her work with sharp, critical eyes. There was no fake glamour, no toxic judgment about her appearance, and absolutely no suffocating expectations to perform the role of a submissive, decorative wife. She commanded the room with effortless, undeniable authority. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that radiated power and uncompromising professionalism, engaging in intense debates about sustainable building materials and modern zoning regulations. The influential men and women in the room did not look at her as an extension of a wealthy husband or an heiress to a logistics empire. They looked at her as a formidable, highly competent equal. She navigated the crowded floor with a radiant, authentic confidence that had been systematically suppressed for over a year. She laughed freely, a genuine, unburdened sound that echoed brightly against the high brick walls. I watched a prominent city developer approach her with a massive commercial contract, treating her insights with profound, hard-earned respect. Brent had spent their entire marriage desperately trying to convince her that she was a small, fragile, and utterly dependent creature who required his superior guidance to navigate the world. Looking at her now holding court among the city's most respected builders, that toxic illusion was completely eradicated. She had actively reclaimed her voice, her career, and her absolute autonomy. She was no longer surviving a fraudulent marriage. She was actively conquering her own designated territory. I remained deliberately near the back of the expansive room, partially obscured by a massive structural support pillar. I did not want to cast a heavy paternal shadow over her absolute triumph. I held a simple glass of sparkling water, silently observing my daughter shine under the warm industrial lights of her own creation. The profound psychological trauma Brent had inflicted upon her could have easily broken a weaker person. It could have driven her into permanent isolation, leaving her terrified of trust and permanently paralyzed by betrayal. Instead, the year of suffocating manipulation and emotional abuse had acted as a brutal, unforgiving forge. The intense heat of that fraudulent marriage had burned away every last ounce of her naivety and vulnerability, forging her spirit into unbreakable, hardened steel. She had faced the absolute worst of human predatory greed and emerged completely victorious, possessing a lethal, uncompromising strength that no one would ever dare challenge again. I caught her eye through the bustling crowd of architects and developers. She paused her conversation, raising her glass toward me with a subtle, deeply meaningful nod of gratitude and absolute closure. I returned the gesture, a silent acknowledgement between two survivors who had successfully defended our bloodline against a violent infection. I set my glass down on a nearby side table and turned toward the exit. I slipped out the heavy iron doors completely unnoticed, leaving the vibrant, energetic sounds of her professional victory behind me. I walked through the cool evening air toward the adjacent parking lot, my footsteps steady and profoundly unburdened. I unlocked the heavy metal door of my old, reliable Ford truck, climbing into the worn leather driver's seat that had grounded me for decades. I turned the ignition, the familiar, comforting roar of the diesel engine filling the quiet street. I shifted the truck into gear and drove slowly out of the industrial district, navigating the quiet city streets back toward my modest, unassuming house. The sprawling, invisible labyrinth I had constructed a year ago was now fully dismantled, having perfectly served its destructive purpose. The brutal, silent war was officially permanently over, and my family had finally won. I sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair on my back porch, the rhythmic creak of the timber providing a steady, grounding metronome against the fading daylight. The sun was dipping below the dense tree line of my quiet, unassuming neighborhood, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawn. The cool evening breeze carried the sharp scent of pine and impending autumn, a stark and welcome contrast to the sterile, suffocating air of the corporate boardrooms and federal holding cells that had defined the past several months of my life. I leaned back into the worn cushions, letting the profound stillness of the moment wash over me, and allowed my mind to drift across the long, brutal trajectory of my existence. Decades ago, I was nothing more than a bruised, exhausted kid loading heavy wooden pallets on the freezing industrial docks long before dawn. I possessed no aristocratic pedigree, no hidden trust fund, and absolutely no financial safety net. I fought fiercely for every single inch of ground I stood upon, transforming the raw, bleeding desperation of poverty into a ruthless, highly efficient national logistics empire. I learned very early in those freezing warehouses that emotional noise was a profound, fatal weakness. The men who shouted, cursed, and threatened physical violence were always the very first to break under genuine, sustained pressure. True power was never loud. When Brent first revealed his toxic, parasitic nature to me, every primitive instinct in my body demanded immediate, overwhelming physical retribution. I possessed the liquid capital and the deep underground connections to have him permanently crippled before he even finished his morning coffee. I could have easily hired desperate, violent men to break his bones and shatter his arrogant jaw, leaving him bleeding in a forgotten gutter. But that kind of visceral emotional violence would have been a catastrophic failure of discipline. It would have created unnecessary legal liabilities, and far more importantly, it would have denied Naomi the vital opportunity to forge her own impenetrable armor. I chose instead to protect my greatest asset through the absolute discipline of silence. I constructed a flawless, invisible labyrinth around him, allowing his own unchecked greed and repulsive bigotry to trigger every single trap. I did not raise a single hand against him. I simply arranged the exact circumstances required for him to entirely and permanently destroy himself. The fading orange sunlight caught the edges of the thick, worn leather notebook resting on the small iron table beside me. The dark leather was deeply scratched and heavily weathered, serving as a physical, tangible manifestation of the heavy burdens and brutal conflicts I had carried over my lifetime. I reached out and flipped the heavy cover open, bypassing decades of permanently settled scores and eliminated threats. I turned directly to the very first page of the current section. Brent's full legal name was written in sharp, meticulous black ink right at the top of the crisp parchment. I had written it down the exact evening he had first insulted my daughter in my presence, silently binding his fate to my personal ledger. I retrieved a heavy red fountain pen from my shirt pocket, unscrewed the brass cap, and pressed the sharp metal nib firmly against the thick paper. I drew a thick, dark red line straight through the center of his name, watching the crimson ink bleed slightly into the grain of the page. The physical act of crossing him out carried a profound, heavy finality. He was no longer an active threat. He was a completely solved equation. My highly placed legal contacts had informed me just that morning that Brent had officially broken under the crushing, undeniable weight of the federal indictment. Terrified of a lengthy, highly publicized trial that would expose every humiliating detail of his fraud to the world, he had accepted a brutal, uncompromising plea deal. He was formally sentenced to 5 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his remaining assets and his fabricated dignity. However, the Department of Justice was the absolute least of his problems. The federal prison system offered him 5 temporary years of highly monitored, scheduled protection, but the violent underground creditors he had brazenly defrauded were exceptionally patient men. They did not forgive, and they certainly did not forget. They were already waiting for the exact minute he stepped out of those heavy prison gates. They would collect their missing millions in blood, ensuring the remainder of his pathetic, ruined life would be a frantic, terrified scramble for basic survival. He would never experience a single moment of genuine peace again. I stared at the dark red line cutting violently through his name, verifying the absolute destruction of my enemy. The debt had been paid in full. The ledger was perfectly irrevocably balanced. The sudden sharp vibration of my mobile phone buzzing against the wooden table abruptly shattered the quiet evening silence. I closed the leather notebook, setting the heavy red pen down beside it, and picked up the device. The bright screen illuminated the encroaching darkness of the back porch. A text message from Naomi flashed across the display, the typed words carrying a profound, radiant energy that easily transcended the digital screen. She informed me that she had just officially closed the Wilson contract. It was a massive, highly coveted urban development project that firmly cemented her independent architecture firm as a dominant, untouchable force in the city's infrastructure. She had secured the multi-million-dollar deal entirely on her own brilliance, thoroughly dismantling her established competitors through pure, uncompromising talent and relentless preparation. The second sentence of her message struck me with a heavy, profound warmth that settled deep into my chest. She thanked me for everything, stating with absolute clarity that I was her hero. I read the words 3 times, letting the profound weight of her gratitude wash over me. I had not handed her a lucrative business, nor had I fought her professional battles for her. I had simply cleared the toxic, parasitic debris from her path, allowing her to step fully into her own immense power. I locked the phone screen and set it face down on the iron table. I picked up my heavy ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of my bitter black coffee, welcoming the dark, familiar taste. The evening air grew noticeably colder, but a profound, untouchable warmth radiated through my entire body. I looked out over the quiet, darkening street, reflecting on the absolute perfection of the outcome. the weak men of the world. The arrogant, posturing frauds like Brent always reacted to challenges with loud emotional noise and impotent thrashing anger. They flailed violently, mistaking their theatrical arrogance for genuine strength. The truly strong do not waste their breath on empty threats or public displays of emotional dominance. The strong establish absolute order, protect their bloodline at all costs, and completely eradicate their enemies through the flawless application of deadly, calculated silence. I leaned back into the rocking chair, listening to the wind rustle heavily through the autumn leaves. The brutal campaign was completely finished. My daughter was thriving, my enemies were utterly destroyed, and my empire remained completely untouchable. True power is never loud. It does not need to scream, threaten, or throw tantrums to prove its existence. When confronted with betrayal, the weakest individuals react with explosive anger, making themselves vulnerable through a complete lack of emotional control. The strongest individuals embrace the brutal discipline of silence. They observe, calculate, and let enemies destroy themselves through their own unchecked greed. Protecting your family does not always require physical violence or public confrontation. Sometimes the absolute most devastating and effective weapon you can wield is simply allowing a toxic person to fall into an entirely silent, perfectly orchestrated trap. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this satisfying conclusion, and hit the subscribe button for more thrilling narratives.